Chapter 17, Part 3 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 2, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, The Polar Journey, The Pole and After, Part 3. January 23rd. Started off with a bit of a breeze which helped us a little, temperature minus 28 degrees. After the first 2 hours it increased to force 4 south-southwest, and filling the sail we sped along merrily, doing 8 3/4 miles before lunch. In the afternoon it was even stronger, and I had to go back on the sledge and act as a guide and a brakesman. We had to lower the sail a bit, but even then she ran like a bird. We are picking up our old cairns famously. Evans got his nose frostbitten, not an unusual thing with him, but as we are all getting pretty cold latterly, we stopped at 6:45, having done 16½ miles. We camped with considerable difficulty owing to the force of the wind. The same night Scott wrote, "We came along at a great pace and should have got within an easy march of our 1½ degree depôt, had not Wilson suddenly discovered that Evans' nose was frostbitten. It was white and hard. We thought it best to camp at 6:45. Got the tent up with some difficulty, and now pretty cosy after good hoosh. There is no doubt that Evans is a good deal run down. His fingers are badly blistered, and his nose is rather seriously congested with frequent frostbites. He is very much annoyed with himself, which is not a good sign. I think Wilson, Bowers and I are as fit as possible under the circumstances. Oates gets cold feet. One way and another, I shall be glad to get off the summit. The weather seems to be breaking up." Bowers resumes the tale. January 24th. Evans has got his fingers all blistered with frostbites. Otherwise we are all well, but thinning, and in spite of our good rations get hungrier daily. I sometimes spend much thought on the march with plans for making a pig of myself on the first opportunity. As that will be after a further march of 700 miles, they are a bit premature. It was blowing a gale when we started, and it increased in force. Finally, with the sail half down, one man detached trekking ahead, and Titus and I breaking back, we could not always keep the sledge from overrunning. The blizzard got worse and worse, till, having done only 7 miles, we had to camp soon after 12 o'clock. We had a most difficult job camping, and it has been blowing like blazes all the afternoon. I think it is moderating now, 9 p.m. We are only 7 miles from our depôt, and this delay is exasperating." Scott wrote, "This is the second full gale since we left the Pole. I don't like the look of it. Is the weather breaking up? If so, God help us, with the tremendous summit journey and scant food. Wilson and Bowers are my standby. I don't like the easy way in which Oates and Evans get frostbitten." January 25th. It was no use turning out at our usual time, 5:45 a.m, as the blizzard was as furious as ever. We therefore decided on a late breakfast and no lunch, unless able to march. We have only 3 days' food with us, and shall be in Queer Street if we miss the depôt. Our bags are getting steadily wetter, so are our clothes. It shows a tendency to clear off now, breakfast time, so, D.V., we may march after all. I am in tribulation as regards meals now, as we have run out of salt, one of my favourite commodities. It is owing to Atkinson's party taking back an extra tin by mistake from the Upper Glacier depôt. Fortunately we have some depot there, so I will only have to endure another 2 weeks without it. 10 p.m. We have got in a march after all, I thank the Lord. Assisted by the wind we made an excellent run down to our 1½ degree depôt, where the big red flag was blowing out like fury with the breeze, in clouds of driving drift. Here we picked up 1¼ cans of oil and 1 week's food for 5 men, together with some personal gear depôted. We left the bamboo and flag on the cairn. I was much relieved to pick up the depôt. Now we only have one other source of anxiety on this endless snow summit, viz. the 3 degree depôt, in latitude 86 degrees 56 minutes south. In the afternoon we did 5.2 miles. It was a miserable march, blizzard all the time, and our sledge either sticking in sastrugi or overrunning the traces. We had to lower the sail half down, and Titus and I hung on to her. It was most strenuous work, as well as much colder than pulling ahead. Most of the time we had to break back with all our strength to keep the sledge from overrunning. Bill got a bad go of snow glare from following the track without goggles on. This day last year we started the depot journey. I did not think so short a time would turn me into an old hand at polar travelling. Neither did I imagine at the time that I would be returning from the pole itself." Wilson was very subject to these attacks of snow blindness, and also to headaches before blizzards. I have an idea that his anxiety to sketch whenever opportunity offered, and his willingness to take off his goggles to search for tracks and cairns, had something to do with it. This attack was very typical. "I wrote this at lunch, and in the evening had a bad attack of snow blindness. Blizzard in the afternoon. We only got in a forenoon march. Couldn't see enough of the tracks to follow at all. My eyes didn't begin to trouble me till tomorrow (yesterday), though it was the strain of tracking and the very cold drift which we had today that gave me this attack of snow glare. Marched on foot in the afternoon as my eyes were too bad to go on ski. We had a lot of drift and wind and very cold. Had ZNSO4 and cocaine in my eyes at night, and didn't get to sleep at all for the pain. Dozed about an hour in the morning only. Marched on foot again all day as I couldn't see my way on ski at all. Birdie used my ski. Eyes still very painful and watering. Tired out by the evening. Had a splendid night's sleep, and though very painful across forehead tonight, they are much better." The surface was awful. In his diary of the day after they left the pole, January 19th, Wilson wrote an account of it. "We had a splendid wind right behind us most of the afternoon, and went well until about 6 p.m, when the sun came out and we had an awful grind until 7:30, when we camped. The sun comes out on sandy drifts, all on the move in the wind, and temperature -20°, and gives us an absolutely awful surface with no glide at all for ski or sledge, and just like fine sand. The weather all day has been more or less overcast, with white broken alto stratus, and for 3 degrees above the horizon there is a grey belt looking like a blizzard of drift, but this in reality is caused by a constant fall of minute snow crystals, very minute. Sometimes instead of crystal plates the fall is of minute agglomerate spicules like tiny sea urchins. The plates glitter in the sun as though of some size, but you can only just see them as pinpoints on your Burberry. So the spicule collections are only just visible. Our hands are never warm enough in camp to do any neat work now. The weather is always uncomfortably cold and windy, about -23°, but after lunch today I got a bit of drawing done." All the joy had gone from their sledging. They were hungry, they were cold, the pulling was very heavy, and 2 of them were not fit. As long ago as January 14th, Scott wrote that Oates was feeling the cold and fatigue more than the others, and again he refers to the matter on January 20th. On January 19th Wilson wrote, "We get our hairy faces and mouths dreadfully iced up on the march, and often one's hands very cold indeed holding ski sticks. Evans, who cut his knuckle some days ago at the last depôt, has a lot of pus in it tonight." January 20th. "Evans has got 4 or 5 of his fingertips badly blistered by the cold. Titus also his nose and cheeks. Also Evans and Bowers." January 28th. "Evans has a number of badly blistered finger ends which he got at the pole. Titus's big toe is turning blue-black." January 31st. "Evans' fingernails are coming off, very raw and sore." February 4th. "Evans is feeling the cold a lot, always getting frostbitten. Titus's toes are blackening, and his nose and cheeks are dead yellow. Dressing Evans' fingers every other day with boric Vaseline. They are quite sweet still." February 5th. "Evans' fingers suppurating. Nose very bad, hard, and rotten looking." Scott was getting alarmed about Evans, who "has dislodged 2 fingernails tonight. His hands are really bad, and to my surprise he shows signs of losing heart over it. He hasn't been cheerful since the accident. The party is not improving in condition, especially Evans, who is becoming rather dull and incapable. Evans' nose is almost as bad as his fingers. He is a good deal crocked up." Bowers' diary, quoted above, finished on January 25th, on which day they picked up their 1½ degree depôt. "I shall sleep much better with our provision bag full again," wrote Scott that night. "Bowers got another rating sight tonight. It was wonderful how he managed to observe in such a horribly cold wind." They marched 16 miles the next day, but got off the outward track, which was crooked. On January 27th they did 14 miles, on a "very bad surface of deep-cut sastrugi all day, until late in the afternoon, when we began to get out of them." "By Jove, this is tremendous labour," said Scott. They were getting into the better surfaces again, 15.7 miles for January 28th. A fine day and a good march on a very decent surface." On January 29 Bowers wrote his last full day's diary. "Our record march to day. With a good breeze and improving surface we were soon in among the double tracks where the supporting party left us. Then we picked up the memorable camp where I transferred to the advance party. How glad I was to change over. The camp was much drifted up and immense sastrugi were everywhere, south-south-east in direction and south-east. We did 10.4 miles before lunch. I was breaking back on sledge and controlling. It was beastly cold and my hands were perished. In the afternoon I put on my dogskin mitts and was far more comfortable. A stiff breeze with drift continues, temperature -25 degrees. Thank God our days of having to face it are over. We completed 19.5 miles, 22 statute, this evening, and so are only 29 miles from our precious 3-degree depôt. It will be bad luck indeed if we do not get there in a march and a half anyhow." 19 miles again on January 30th, but during the previous day's march Wilson had strained a tendon in his leg. "I got a nasty bruise on the tibialis anticus, which gave me great pain in the afternoon. My left leg exceedingly painful all day, so I gave Birdie my ski and hobbled alongside the sledge on foot. The whole of the tibialis anticus is swollen and tight, and full of tenosynovitis, and the skin red and oedematous over the shin. But we made a very fine march with the help of a brisk breeze." January 31st. Again walking by the sledge with swollen leg, but not nearly so painful. We had 5.8 miles to go to reach the 3-degree depôt. Picked this up with a week's provision and a line from Evans, and then for lunch an extra biscuit each, making 4 for lunch and 1/10 of a whack of butter extra as well. Afternoon we passed Cairn where Birdie's ski had been left. These we picked up and came on till 7:30 p.m. when the wind, which had been very light all day, dropped, and with temperature -20 degrees it felt delightfully warm and sunny and clear. We have 1/10 extra pemmican in the hoosh now also. My leg pretty swollen again tonight. They travelled 13.5 miles that day and 15.7 on the next. My leg much more comfortable, gave me no pain, and I was able to pull all day, holding on to the sledge. Still some edema. We came down 100 feet or so today on a fairly steep gradient. They were now approaching the crevassed surfaces and the ice falls which marked the entrance to the Beardmore Glacier, and February 2nd was marked by another accident, this time to Scott. "On a very slippery surface I came an awful perler on my shoulder. It is horribly sore tonight, and another sick person added to our tent, 3 out of 5 injured, and the most troublesome surfaces to come. We shall be lucky if we get through without serious injury. Wilson's leg is better, but might easily get bad again, and Evans' fingers. We have managed to get off 17 miles. The extra food is certainly helping us, but we are getting pretty hungry. The weather is already a trifle warmer, the altitude lower, and only 80 miles or so to Mount Darwin. It is time we were off the summit. Pray God another 4 days will see us pretty well clear of it. Our bags are getting very wet, and we ought to have more sleep." They had been spending some time in finding the old tracks, but they had a good landfall for the depôt at the top of the glacier, and on February 3rd they decided to push on due north, and to worry no more for the present about tracks and cairns. They did 16 miles that day. Wilson's diary runs, "Sunny and breezy again. Came down a series of slopes and finished the day by going up one. Enormous deep cut sastrugi and drifts and shiny eggshell surface. Wind all south-south-easterly. Today at about 11 p.m. we got our first sight again of mountain peaks on our eastern horizon. We crossed the outmost line of crevassed ridge top today, the first on our return." February 4th. 18 miles. Clear, cloudless blue sky, surface drift. During forenoon we came down gradual descent, including 2 or 3 irregular terrace slopes, on crest of one of which were a good many crevasses. Southernmost were just big enough for Scott and Evans to fall in to their waists, and very deceptively covered up. They ran east and west. Those nearer the crest were the ordinary broad street-like crevasses, well lidded. In the afternoon we again came to a crest, before descending, with street crevasses, and one we crossed had a huge hole where the lid had fallen in, big enough for a horse and cart to go down. We have a great number of mountain tops on our right and south of our beam as we go due north now. We are now camped just below a great crevassed mound, on a mountain top evidently. February 5th, 18.2 miles. We had a difficult day, getting in amongst a frightful chaos of broad chasm-like crevasses. We kept too far east and had to wind in and out amongst them and cross multitudes of bridges. We then bore west a bit and got on better all the afternoon and got round a good deal of the upper disturbances of the falls here." Scott wrote, "We are camped in a very disturbed region, but the wind has fallen very light here, and our camp is comfortable for the first time for many weeks." "February 6th, 15 miles. We again had a forenoon of trying to cut corners, got in amongst great chasms running east and west, and had to come out again. We then again kept west and downhill over tremendous sastrugi with a slight breeze, very cold. In afternoon continued bearing more and more towards Mount Darwin. We got round one of the main lines of ice fall and looked back up to it. Very cold march, many crevasses. I, walking by the sledge on foot, found a good many, the others all on ski. February 7th, 15.5 miles. Clear day again, and we made a tedious march in the forenoon along a flat or two, and down a long slope, and then in the afternoon we had a very fresh breeze, and a very fast run down long slopes covered with big sastrugi. It was a strenuous job steering and checking behind by the sledge. We reached the Upper Glacier Depôt by 7:30 p.m. and found everything right." This was the end of the plateau, the beginning of the glacier. Their hard time should be over so far as the weather was concerned. Wilson notes how fine the land looked as they approached it. "The colour of the Dominion Range rock is in the main all brown madder or dark reddish chocolate, but there are numerous bands of yellow rock scattered amongst it. I think it is composed of dolerite and sandstone as on the west side." End of chapter 17, part 3. Chapter 17, part 4 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 2, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, The Polar Journey, The Pole and After, part 4. The condition of the party was of course giving anxiety. How much it is impossible to say. A good deal was to be hoped from the warm weather ahead. Scott and Bowers were probably the fittest men. Scott's shoulder soon mended, and "Bowers is splendid, full of energy and bustle all the time." Wilson was feeling the cold more than either of them now. His leg was not yet well enough to wear ski. Oates had suffered from a cold foot for some time. Evans, however, was the only man whom Scott seems to have been worried about. "His cuts and wounds suppurate, his nose looks very bad, and altogether he shows considerable signs of being played out. Well, we have come through our 7 weeks' ice cap journey, and most of us are fit, but I think another week might have had a very bad effect on Petty Officer Evans, who is steadily going downhill." They had all been having extra food which had helped them much, though they complained of hunger and want of sleep. Directly they got into the warmer weather of the glacier their food satisfied them. "But we must march to keep on the full ration, and we want rest, yet we shall pull through all right. D.V., we are by no means worn out." There are no germs in the Antarctic, save for a few isolated specimens which are almost certainly come down from civilization in the upper air currents. You can sleep all night in a wet bag and clothing, and sledge all day in a mail of ice, and you will not catch a cold nor get any aches. You can get deficiency diseases like scurvy, for inland this is a deficiency country without vitamins. You can also get poisoned if you allow your food to remain thawed out too long, and if you do not cover the provisions in a depôt with enough snow, the sun will get at them, even though the air temperature is far below freezing, but it is not easy to become diseased. On the other hand, once something does go wrong, it is the deuce and all to get it right, especially cuts, and the isolation of the polar traveller may place him in the most difficult circumstances. There are no ambulances and hospitals, and a man on a sledge is a very serious weight. Practically any man who undertakes big polar journeys must face the possibility of having to commit suicide to save his companions, and the difficulty of this must not be overrated, for it is in some ways more desirable to die than to live if things are bad enough. We got to that stage on the winter journey. I remember discussing this question with Bowers, who had a scheme of doing himself in with a pickaxe if necessity arose, though how he could have accomplished it I don't know. Or, as he said, there might be a crevasse, and at any rate there was the medical case. I was horrified at the time. I had never faced the thing out with myself like that. They left the Upper Glacier Depôt under Mount Darwin on February 8th. This day they collected the most important of those geological specimens to which, at Wilson's special request, they clung to the end, and which were mostly collected by him. Mount Darwin and Buckley Island, which are really the tops of high mountains, stick out of the ice at the top of the glacier, and the course ran near to both of them, but not actually up against them. Shackleton found coal on Buckley Island, and it was clear that the place was of great geological importance, for it was one of the only places in the Antarctic where fossils could be found, so far as we knew. The icefalls stretched away as far as you could see towards the mountains, which bound the glacier on either side, and as you looked upwards towards Buckley Island they were like a long breaking wave. One of the great difficulties about the Beardmore was that you saw the icefalls as you went up and avoided them, but coming down you knew nothing of their whereabouts until you fell into the middle of pressure and crevasses, and then it was almost impossible to say whether you should go right or left to get out. Evans was unable to pull this day and was detached from the sledge, but this was not necessarily a very serious sign. Shackleton on his return journey was not able to pull at this place. Wilson wrote as follows: February 8th, Mount Buckley Cliffs. A very busy day. We had a very cold forenoon march, blowing like blazes from the south. Birdie detached and went on ski to Mount Darwin and collected some dolerite, the only rock he could see on the Nunatak, which was the nearest. We got into a sort of crusted surface where the snow broke through nearly to our knees, and the sledge runner also. I thought at first we were all on a thinly bridged crevasse. We then came on east a bit and gradually got worse and worse going over an ice fall, having great trouble to prevent sledge taking charge, but eventually got down and then made northwest or north into the land and camped right by the moraine under the great sandstone cliffs of Mount Buckley, out of the wind and quite warm again. It was a wonderful change. After lunch we all geologized on till supper, and I was very late turning in, examining the moraine after supper. Socks all strewn over the rocks dried splendidly. Magnificent beacon sandstone cliffs, masses of limestone in the moraine, and dolerite crags in various places. Coal seams at all heights in the sandstone cliffs, and lumps of weathered coal with fossil vegetable. Had a regular field day and got some splendid things in the short time. February 9th, moraine visit. We made our way along down the moraine, and at the end of Mount Buckley unhitched and had half an hour over the rocks, and again got some good things written up in the sketchbook. We then left the moraine and made a very good march on rough blue ice all day, with very small and scarce scraps of névé, on one of which we camped for the night, with a rather overcast foggy sky, which cleared to bright sun in the night. We are all thoroughly enjoying temperatures of +10 degrees or thereabouts now, with no wind instead of the summit winds, which are incessant, with temperature -20 degrees. February 10th. We made a very good forenoon march from 10 to 2:45 towards the Cloudmaker. Weather overcast gradually obscured everything in snowfall fog, starting with crystals of large size. We had to camp after 2½ hours afternoon march, as it got too thick to see anything, and we were going downhill on blue ice. The next day, in bad lights and on a bad surface, they fell into the same pressure which both the other returning parties experienced. Like them, they were in the middle of it before they realized. Then came the fatal decision to steer east. We went on for 6 hours, hoping to do a good distance, which I suppose we did, but for the last hour or two we pressed on into a regular trap. Getting on to a good surface, we did not reduce our lunch meal, and thought all going well, but half an hour after lunch we got into the worst ice mess I have ever been in. For 3 hours we plunged on ski, first thinking we were too much to the right, then too much to the left. Meanwhile the disturbance got worse, and my spirits received a very rude shock. There were times when it seemed almost impossible to find a way out of the awful turmoil in which we found ourselves. The turmoil changed in character, irregular crevasse surface giving way to huge chasms, closely packed and most difficult to cross. It was very heavy work, but we had grown desperate. We won through at 10 p.m, and I write after 12 hours on the march. Wilson continues the story. February 12th. We had a good night just outside the ice falls and disturbances, and a small breakfast of tea, thin hoosh and biscuit, and began the forenoon by a decent bit of travelling on rubbly blue ice in crampons, then plunged into an icefall and wandered about in it for hours and hours. February 13th. We had one biscuit and some tea after a night's sleep on very hard and irregular blue ice amongst the icefall crevasses. No snow on the tent, only ski, etc. Got away at 10 a.m. and by 2 p.m. found the depot, having had a good march over very hard rough blue ice. Only half an hour in the disturbance of yesterday. The weather was very thick, snowing and overcast, could only just see the points of bearing for depot. However, we got there, tired and hungry, and camped and had hoosh and tea and 3 biscuits each. Then away again with our 3½ days' food from this red flag depot and off down by the Cloudmaker moraine. We travelled about 4 hours on hard blue ice, and I was allowed to geologize the last hour down the 2 outer lines of boulders. The outer one all dolerite and quartz rocks, the inner all dolerite and sandstone. We camped on the inner line of boulders, weather clearing all the afternoon. Meanwhile both Wilson and Bowes had been badly snowblind, though Wilson does not mention it in his diary, and this night Scott says Evans had no power to assist with camping work. A good march followed on February 14th, but "there is no getting away from the fact that we are not pulling strong. Probably none of us. Wilson's leg still troubles him and he doesn't like to trust himself on ski. But the worst case is Evans, who is giving us serious anxiety. This morning he suddenly disclosed a huge blister on his foot. It delayed us on the march, when he had to have his crampon readjusted. Sometimes I feel he is going from bad to worse, but I trust he will pick up again when we come to steady work on ski like this afternoon. He is hungry and so is Wilson. We can't risk opening out our food again, and as cook at present I am serving something under full allowance. We are inclined to get slack and slow with our camping arrangement, and small delays increase. I have talked of the matter tonight and hope for improvement. We cannot do the distance without the hours." There was something wrong with this party, more wrong, I mean, than was justified by the tremendous journey they had already experienced. Except for the blizzard at the bottom of the Beardmore and the surfaces near the Pole, it had been little worse than they expected. Evans, however, who was considered by Scott to be the strongest man of the party, had already collapsed, and it is admitted that the rest of the party was becoming far from strong. There seems to be an unknown factor here somewhere. Wilson's diary continues. February 15th, 13 3/4 miles geographic. I got on ski again first time since damaging my leg and was on them all day for 9 hours. It was a bit painful and swelled by the evening, and every night I put on snow poultice. We are not yet abreast of Mount Kiffin, and much discussion how far we are from the lower glacier depot, probably 18 to 20 miles, and we have to reduce food again. Only 1 biscuit tonight with a thin hoosh of pemmican. Tomorrow we have to make 1 day's food which remains last over the 2. The weather became heavily overcast during the afternoon and then began to snow, and though we got in our 4 hours' march it was with difficulty, and we only made a bit over 5 miles. However, we are nearer the depot tonight. February 16th, 12½ miles geographic. Got a good start in fair weather after 1 biscuit and a thin breakfast, and made 7½ miles in the forenoon. Again the weather became overcast, and we lunched almost at our old bearing on Kiffin of lunch December 15th. All the afternoon the weather became thick and thicker, and after 3¼ hours Evans collapsed, sick and giddy, and unable to walk even by the sledge on ski, so we camped. Can see no land at all anywhere, but we must be getting pretty near the Pillar Rock. Evans' collapse has much to do with the fact that he has never been sick in his life, and is now helpless with his hands frostbitten. We had thin meals for lunch and supper. February 17th. The weather cleared and we got away for a clear run to the depot, and had gone a good part of the way when Evans found his ski shoes coming off. He was allowed to readjust and continue to pull, but it happened again and then again, so he was told to unhitch, get them right, and follow on and catch us up. He lagged far behind till lunch, and when we camped we had lunch, and then went back for him as he had not come up. He had fallen, and had his hands frostbitten, and we then returned for the sledge and brought it and fetched him in on it, as he was rapidly losing the use of his legs. He was comatose when we got him into the tent, and he died without recovering consciousness that night, about 10 p.m. We had a short rest for an hour or 2 in our bags that night, then had a meal and came on through the pressure ridges about 4 miles farther down, and reached our lower glacier depot. Here we camped at last, had a good meal and slept a good night's rest, which we badly needed. Our depot was all right. A very terrible day. On discussing the symptoms we think he began to get weaker just before we reached the Pole, and that his downward path was accelerated first by the shock of his frostbitten fingers, and later by falls during rough travelling on the glacier, further by his loss of all confidence in himself. Wilson thinks it certain he must have injured his brain by a fall. It is a terrible thing to lose a companion in this way, but calm reflection shows that there could not have been a better ending to the terrible anxieties of the past week. Discussion of the situation at lunch yesterday shows us what a desperate pass we were in, with a sick man on our hands at such a distance from home. End of chapter 17, part 4. Chapter 18, part 1 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 2, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, The Polar Journey, Farthest South, Part 1. This happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, this land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land. Shakespeare. Stevenson has written of a traveller whose wife slumbered by his side what time his spirit re-adventured forth in memory of days gone by. He was quite happy about it, and I suppose his travels had been peaceful, for days and nights such as these men spent coming down the Beardmore will give you nightmare after nightmare, and wake you shrieking years after. Of course they were shaken and weakened, but the conditions they had faced, and the time they had been out, do not, in my opinion, account entirely for their weakness, nor for Evans' collapse, which may have had something to do with the fact that he was the biggest, heaviest and most muscular man in the party. I do not believe that this is a life for such men, who are expected to pull their weight and to support and drive a larger machine than their companions, and at the same time to eat no extra food. If, as seems likely, the ration these men were eating was not enough to support the work they were doing, then it is clear that the heaviest man will feel the deficiency sooner and more severely than the others who are smaller than he. Evans must have had a most terrible time. I think it is clear from the diaries that he had suffered very greatly without complaint. At home he would have been nursed in bed. Here he must march. He was pulling the day he died, until he was crawling on his frostbitten hands and knees in the snow. Horrible. Most horrible, perhaps, for those who found him so, and sat in the tent and watched him die. I am told that simple concussion does not kill as suddenly as this. Probably some clot had moved in his brain. For one reason and another they took very nearly as long to come down the glacier with a featherweight sledge as we had taken to go up it with full loads. 7 days' food were allowed from the upper to the lower glacier depot. Bowers told me that he thought this was running it fine, but the two supporting parties got through all right, though they both tumbled into the horrible pressure above the Cloudmaker. The last return party took 7½ days, the Polar Party 10 days. The latter had been 25½ days longer on the plateau than the former. Owing to their slow progress down the glacier, the Polar Party went on short rations for the first and last time until they camped on March 19th. With the exception of these days they had either their full or more than their full ration until that date. Until they reached the Barrier on their return journey, the weather can be described neither as abnormal nor as unexpected. There were 300 statute miles (260 geographic) to be covered to 1 ton depot, and 150 statute miles (130 geographic) more from 1 ton to Hut Point. They had just picked up 1 week's food for 5 men. Between the Beardmore and 1 ton there were 3 more depots each with 1 week's food for 5 men. They were 4 men. Their way was across the main body of the Barrier, out of sight of land, and away from any immediate influence of the comparatively warm sea ahead of them. Nothing was known of the weather conditions in the middle of the Barrier at this time of the year, and no one suspected that March conditions there were very cold. Shackleton turned homeward on January 10th, reached his Bluff depot on February 23rd, and Hut Point on February 28th. Wilson's diary continues. February 18th. We had only 5 hours sleep. We had butter and biscuit and tea when we woke at 2 p.m, then came over the Gap entrance to the pony slaughter camp, visiting a rock moraine of Mount Hope on the way. February 19th. Late in getting away after making up new 10-foot sledge and digging out pony meat. We made 5½ miles on a very heavy surface indeed." This bad surface is the feature of their first homeward marches on the Barrier. From now onwards they complain always of the terrible surfaces, but a certain amount of the heavy pulling must be ascribed to their own weakness. In the low temperatures which occurred later, bad surfaces were to be expected, but now the temperatures were not really low, about 0 to -17°. Fine clear days for the most part, and, a thing to be noticed, little wind. They wanted wind which would probably be behind them from the south. "Oh, for a little wind," Scott writes. E. Evans evidently had plenty. He was already very anxious. "If this goes on we shall have a bad time, but I sincerely trust it is only the result of this windless area close to the coast, and that, as we are making steadily outwards, we shall shortly escape it. It is perhaps premature (February 19th) to be anxious about covering distance. In all other respects things are improving. We have our sleeping bags spread on the ledge and they are drying, but above all we have our full measure of food again. To night we had a sort of stew fry of pemmican and horse flesh, and voted it the best hoosh we had ever had on a sledge journey. The absence of poor Evans is a help to the commissariat, but if he had been here in a fit state we might have got along faster. I wonder what is in store for us, with some little alarm at the lateness of the season." And on February 20th, when they made 7 miles, "At present our sledge and ski leave deeply ploughed tracks which can be seen winding for miles behind. It is distressing, but as usual trials are forgotten when we camp, and good food is our lot. Pray God we get better travelling, as we are not so fit as we were, and the season is advancing apace." And on February 21st, "We never won a march of 8½ miles with greater difficulty, but we can't go on like this." A breeze suddenly came from south-south-east, force 4 to 6 at 11 a.m. on February 22nd, and they hoisted the sail on the sledge they had just picked up. They immediately lost the tracks they were following and failed to find the cairns and camp remains which they should have picked up if they had been on the right course, which was difficult here owing to the thick weather we had on the outward march. Bowers was sure they were too near the land and steered out, but still failed to pick up the line on which their depots and their lives depended. Scott was convinced they were outside, not inside the line. The next morning Bowers took a round of angles, and they came to the conclusion on slender evidence that they were still too near the land. They had an unhappy march still off the tracks. But just as we decided to lunch, Bowers' wonderful sharp eyes detected an old double lunch cairn. The theodolite telescope confirmed it, and our spirits rose accordingly. Then Wilson had another "bad attack of snow glare, could hardly keep a chink of eye open in goggles to see the course. Fat pony hoosh." This day they reached the Lower Barrier Depôt. They were in evil case, but they would have been all right, these men, if the cold had not come down upon them, a bolt quite literally from the blue of a clear sky, unexpected, unforetold, and fatal. The cold itself was not so tremendous until you realise that they had been out 4 months, that they had fought their way up the biggest glacier in the world in feet of soft snow, that they had spent 7 weeks under plateau conditions of rarefied air, big winds and low temperatures, and they had watched one of their companions die, not in a bed, in a hospital or ambulance, nor suddenly, but slowly, night by night and day by day, with his hands frostbitten and his brain going, until they must have wondered, each man in his heart, whether in such case a human being could be left to die, that 4 men might live. He died a natural death, and they went out onto the Barrier. Given such conditions as were expected, and the conditions for which preparation had been made, they would have come home alive and well. Some men say the weather was abnormal. There is some evidence that it was. The fact remains that the temperature dropped into the -30s by day and the -40s by night. The fact also remains that there was a great lack of southerly winds, and in consequence the air near the surface was not being mixed. Excessive radiation took place, and a layer of cold air formed near the ground. Crystals also formed on the surface of the snow, and the wind was not enough to sweep them away. As the temperature dropped, so the surface for the runners of the sledges became worse, as I explained elsewhere. They were pulling, as it were, through sand. In the face of the difficulties which beset them, their marches were magnificent. 11½ miles on February 25th, and again on the following day, 12.2 miles on February 27th, and 11½ miles again on February 28th and 29th. If they could have kept this up, they would have come through without a doubt, but I think it was about now that they suspected, and then were sure, that they could not pull through. Scott's diary, written at lunch, March 2nd, is as follows. Misfortunes rarely come singly. We marched to the Middle Barrier Depôt fairly easily yesterday afternoon, and since that have suffered 3 distinct blows which have placed us in a bad position. First, we found a shortage of oil. With most rigid economy, it can scarce carry us to the next depôt on this surface, 71 miles away. Second, Titus Oates disclosed his feet, the toes showing very bad indeed, evidently bitten by the late temperatures. The third blow came in the night, when the wind, which we had hailed with some joy, brought dark overcast weather. It fell below -40 in the night, and this morning it took 1½ hours to get our footgear on, but we got away before 8. We lost cairn and tracks together, and made as steadily as we could north by west, but have seen nothing. Worse was to come. The surface is simply awful. In spite of strong wind and full sail, we have only done 5½ miles. We are in a very queer street, since there is no doubt we cannot do the extra marches, and feel the cold horribly. They did nearly 10 miles that day, but on March the 3rd they had a terrible time. God help us, wrote Scott. We can't keep up this pulling, that is certain. Amongst ourselves we are unendingly cheerful, but what each man feels in his heart I can only guess. Putting on footgear in the morning is getting slower and slower, therefore every day more dangerous. The following extracts are taken from Scott's diary. March the 4th, lunch. We are in a very tight place indeed, but none of us despondent yet, or at least we preserve every semblance of good cheer, but one's heart sinks as the sledge stops dead at some sastrugi behind which the surface sand lies thickly heaped. For the moment the temperature is in the -20, an improvement which makes us much more comfortable, but a colder snap is bound to come again soon. I fear that Oates at least will weather such an event very poorly. Providence to our aid. We can expect little from man now except the possibility of extra food at the next depôt. It will be real bad if we get there and find the same shortage of oil. Shall we get there? Such a short distance it would have appeared to us at the summit. I don't know what I should do if Wilson and Bowers weren't so determinedly cheerful over things. Monday, March the 5th, lunch. Regret to say going from bad to worse. We got a slant of wind yesterday afternoon, and going on 5 hours we converted our wretched morning run of 3½ miles into something over 9. We went to bed on a cup of cocoa and pemmican, solid with the chill off. The result is telling on all, but mainly on Oates, whose feet are in a wretched condition. One swelled up tremendously last night, and he is very lame this morning. We started march on tea and pemmican as last night. We pretend to prefer the pemmican this way. Marched for 5 hours this morning over a slightly better surface covered with high moundy sastrugi. Sledge capsized twice. We pulled on foot, covering about 5½ miles. We are 2 pony marches and 4 miles about from our depôt. Our fuel dreadfully low, and the poor soldier nearly done. It is pathetic enough because we can do nothing for him. More hot food might do a little, but only a little, I fear. We none of us expected these terribly low temperatures, and of the rest of us, Wilson is feeling them most, mainly I fear from his self-sacrificing devotion in doctoring Oates's feet. We cannot help each other. Each has enough to do to take care of himself. We get cold on the march, when the trudging is heavy, and the wind pierces our worn garments. The others, all of them, are unendingly cheerful when in the tent. We mean to see the game through with a proper spirit, but it's tough work to be pulling harder than we ever pulled in our lives for long hours, and to feel that the progress is so slow. One can only say God help us, and plod on our weary way, cold and very miserable, though outwardly cheerful. We talk of all sorts of subjects in the tent. Not much of food now, since we decided to take the risk of running a full ration. We simply couldn't go hungry at this time, Tuesday, March 6. Lunch. We did a little better with the help of wind yesterday afternoon, finishing 9½ miles for the day, and 27 miles from depôt, but this morning things have been awful. It was warm in the night, and for the first time during the journey I overslept myself by more than an hour. Then we were slow with the foot gear, then pulling with all our might, for our lives. We could scarcely advance at a rate of a mile an hour. Then it grew thick, and 3 times we had to get out of harness to search for tracks. The result is something less than 3½ miles for the forenoon. The sun is shining now and the wind gone. Poor Oates is unable to pull, sits on the sledge when we are track searching. He is wonderfully plucky, as his feet must be giving him great pain. He makes no complaint, but his spirits only come up in spurts now, and he grows more silent in the tent. We are making a spirit lamp to try and replace the primus when our oil is exhausted. Wednesday, March 7th. A little worse, I fear. One of Oates's feet, very bad this morning. He is wonderfully brave. We still talk of what we will do together at home. We only made 6½ miles yesterday. This morning in 4½ hours we did just over 4 miles. We are 16 from our depôt. If we only find the correct proportion of food there, and this surface continues, we may get to the next depôt, Mount Hooper, 72 miles farther, but not to One Ton Camp. We hope against hope that the dogs have been to Mount Hooper, then we might pull through. If there is a shortage of oil again, we can have little hope. One feels that for poor Oates the crisis is near, but none of us are improving, though we are wonderfully fit considering the really excessive work we are doing. We are only kept going by good food. No wind this morning, till a chill northerly air came ahead. Sun bright and cairn showing up well. I should like to keep the track to the end. Thursday, March 8th. Lunch. Worse and worse in morning. Poor Oates's left foot can never last out, and time over foot gear something awful. Have to wait in night foot gear for nearly an hour before I start changing, and then I'm generally first to be ready. Wilson's feet giving trouble now, but this mainly because he gives so much help to others. We did 4½ miles this morning, and are now 8½ miles from the depôt, a ridiculously small distance to feel in difficulties, yet on this surface we know we cannot equal half our old marches, and that for that effort we expend nearly double the energy. The great question is, what shall we find at the depôt? If the dogs have visited it, we may get along a good distance, but if there is another short allowance of fuel, God help us indeed. We are in a very bad way, I fear, in any case. Saturday, March 10th. Things steadily downhill. Oates' foot worse. He has rare pluck and must know that he can never get through. He asked Wilson if he had a chance this morning, and of course Bill had to say he didn't know. In point of fact, he has none. Apart from him, if he went under now, I doubt whether we could get through. With great care we might have a dog's chance, but no more. The weather conditions are awful, and our gear gets steadily more icy and difficult to manage. Yesterday we marched up the depôt, Mount Hooper. Cold comfort. Shortage on our allowance all round. I don't know that anyone is to blame. The dogs which would have been our salvation have evidently failed. Meares had a bad trip home, I suppose. This morning it was calm when we breakfasted, but the wind came from the west-northwest as we broke camp. It rapidly grew in strength. After travelling for half an hour I saw that none of us could go on facing such conditions. We were forced to camp, and are spending the rest of the day in a comfortless blizzard camp, wind quite foul. End of chapter 18, part 1. Chapter 18, part 2 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 2, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, The Polar Journey, Farthest South, Part 2. Sunday, March the 11th. Titus Oates is very near the end, one feels. What we or he will do, God only knows. We discussed the matter after breakfast. He is a brave fine fellow, and understands the situation, but he practically asked for advice. Nothing could be said but to urge him to march as long as he could. One satisfactory result to the discussion: I practically ordered Wilson to hand over the means of ending our troubles to us, so that any one of us may know how to do so. Wilson had no choice between doing so and our ransacking the medicine case. We have 30 opium tabloids apiece, and he is left with a tube of morphine. So far the tragical side of our story. The sky completely overcast when we started this morning. We could see nothing, lost the tracks, and doubtless have been swaying a good deal since. 3.1 miles for the forenoon. Terribly heavy dragging. Expected it. Know that 6 miles is about the limit of our endurance now, if we get no help from wind or surfaces. We have 7 days' food, and should be about 55 miles from One Ton Camp tonight. 6 times 7 equals 42, leaving us 13 miles short of our distance, even if things get no worse. Meanwhile, the season rapidly advances. Monday, March 12th. We did 6.9 miles yesterday, under our necessary average. Things are left much the same. Oates not pulling much, and now with hands as well as feet pretty well useless. We did 4 miles this morning in 4 hours 20 minutes. We may hope for 3 this afternoon. 7 times 6 equals 42. We shall be 47 miles from the depot. I doubt if we can possibly do it. The surface remains awful, the cold intense, and our physical condition running down. God help us, not a breath of favourable wind for more than a week, and apparently liable to headwinds at any moment. Wednesday, March 14th. No doubt about the going downhill, but everything going wrong for us. Yesterday we woke to a strong northerly wind with temperatures minus 37 degrees. Couldn't face it, so remained in camp till 2, then did 5 1/4 miles. Wanted to march later, but party feeling the cold badly, as the breeze, north, never took off entirely, and as the sun sank the temperature fell. Long time getting supper in the dark. This morning started with southerly breeze, set sail and passed another cairn at good speed. Halfway, however, the wind shifted to west by south or west-south-west, blew through our wind clothes and into our mitts. Poor Wilson horribly cold, could not get off ski for some time. Bowes and I practically made camp, and when we got into the tent, at last we were all deadly cold. Then temperature now, midday down to minus 43 degrees, and the wind strong. We must go on, but now the making of every camp must be more difficult and dangerous. It must be near the end, but a pretty merciful end. Poor Oates got it again in the foot. I shudder to think what it will be like tomorrow. It is only with greatest pains rest of us keep off frostbites. No idea there could be temperatures like this at this time of year, with such winds. Truly awful outside the tent. Must fight it out to the last biscuit, but can't reduce rations. Friday, March 16th, or Saturday 17th. Lost track of dates, but I think the last correct. Tragedy all along the line. At lunch, the day before yesterday, poor Titus Oates said he couldn't go on. He proposed we should leave him in his sleeping bag. That we could not do, and we induced him to come on the afternoon march. In spite of its awful nature for him, he struggled on, and we made a few miles. At night he was worse, and we knew the end had come. Should this be found, I want these facts recorded. Oates' last thoughts were of his mother, but immediately before he took pride in thinking that his regiment would be pleased with the bold way in which he met his death. We can testify to his bravery. He has borne intense suffering for weeks without complaint, and to the very last was able and willing to discuss outside subjects. He did not and would not give up hope till the very end. He was a brave soul. This was the end. He slept through the night before last, hoping not to wake, but he woke in the morning, yesterday. It was blowing a blizzard. He said, "I am just going outside, and maybe some time." He went out into the blizzard, and we have not seen him since. I take this opportunity of saying that we have stuck to our sick companions to the last. In case of Edgar Evans, when absolutely out of food and he lay insensible, the safety of the remainder seemed to demand his abandonment, But Providence mercifully removed him at this critical moment. He died a natural death, and we did not leave him till 2 hours after his death. We knew that poor Oates was walking to his death, but though we tried to dissuade him, we knew it was the act of a brave man and an English gentleman. We all hope to meet the end with a similar spirit, and assuredly the end is not far. I can only write at lunch, and then only occasionally. The cold is intense, -40° at midday. My companions are unendingly cheerful, but we are all on the verge of serious frostbites, and though we constantly talk of fetching through, I don't think any one of us believes it in his heart. We are cold on the march now, and at all times except meals. Yesterday we had to lay up for a blizzard, and today we move dreadfully slowly. We are at No. 14 Pony Camp, only 2 pony marches from One Ton Depôt. We leave here our theodolite, a camera and Oates' sleeping bags. Diaries, etc., and geological specimens, carried at Wilson's special request, will be found with us or on our sledge. Sunday, March 18th. Today, lunch. We are 21 miles from the depôt. Ill fortune presses, but better may come. We have had more wind and drift from ahead yesterday, had to stop marching, wind northwest, force 4, temperature -35°. No human being could face it, and we are worn out nearly. My right foot has gone, nearly all the toes. 2 days ago I was proud possessor of best feet. Bowers takes first place in condition, but there is not much to choose after all. The others are still confident of getting through, or pretend to be, I don't know. We have the last half fill of oil in our primus, and a very small quantity of spirit, this alone between us and thirst. The wind is fair for the moment, and that is perhaps a fact to help. The mileage would have seemed ridiculously small on our outward journey. Monday, March 19th. Lunch. We camped with difficulty last night, and were dreadfully cold till after our supper of cold pemmican and biscuit and a half pannikin of cocoa cooked over the spirit. Then, contrary to expectation, we got warm and all slept well. Today we started in the usual dragging manner. Sledge dreadfully heavy. We are 15½ miles from the depôt, and ought to get there in 3 days. What progress! We have 2 days' food, but barely a day's fuel. All our feet are getting bad. Wilson's best, my right foot worst, left all right. There is no chance to nurse one's feet till we can get hot food into us. Amputation is the least I can hope for now, but will the trouble spread? That is the serious question. The weather doesn't give us a chance. The wind from north to northwest, and -40° temperature today. Wednesday, March 21st. Got within 11 miles of depôt Monday night. Had to lay up all yesterday and severe blizzard. Today forlorn hope. Wilson and Bowers going to depôt for fuel. 22nd and 23rd. Blizzard as bad as ever. Wilson and Bowers unable to start. Tomorrow last chance. No fuel and only 1 or 2 of food left. Must be near the end. Have decided it shall be natural. We shall march for the depôt with or without our effects, and die in our tracks. Thursday, March 29th. Since the 21st we have had a continuous gale from the W.S.W. and S.W. We had fuel to make 2 cups of tea apiece and bare food for 2 days on the 20th. Every day we have been ready to start for our depôt, 11 miles away. But outside the door of the tent it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott. Last entry. For God's sake, look after our people. The following extracts are from letters written by Scott. To Mrs. E. A. Wilson. My dear Mrs. Wilson, if this letter reaches you, Bill and I will have gone out together. We are very near it now, and I should like you to know how splendid he was at the end, everlastingly cheerful and ready to sacrifice himself for others. Never a word of blame to me for leading him into this mess. He is not suffering, luckily, at least only minor discomforts. His eyes have a comfortable blue look of hope, and his mind is peaceful with the satisfaction of his faith in regarding himself as part of the great scheme of the Almighty. I can do no more to comfort you than to tell you that he died as he lived, a brave, true man, the best of comrades and staunchest of friends. My whole heart goes out to you in pity. Yours, R. Scott. To Mrs. Bowers. My dear Mrs. Bowers, I am afraid this will reach you after one of the heaviest blows of your life. I write when we are very near the end of our journey, and I am finishing it in company with two gallant, noble gentlemen. One of these is your son. He had come to be one of my closest and soundest friends, and I appreciate his wonderful upright nature, his ability and energy. As the troubles have thickened, his dauntless spirit ever shone brighter, and he has remained cheerful, hopeful, and indomitable to the end. To Sir J. M. Barrie. My dear Barrie, we are pegging out in a very comfortless spot, hoping this letter may be found and sent to you. I write a word of farewell. Goodbye. I am not at all afraid of the end, but sad to miss many a humble pleasure which I had planned for the future on our long marches. I may not have proved a great explorer, but we have done the greatest march ever made, and come very near to great success. Goodbye, my dear friend. Yours ever, R. Scott. We are in a desperate state. Feet frozen, etc., no fuel, and a long way from food. But it would do your heart good to be in our tent, to hear our songs and the cheery conversation as to what we will do when we get to Hut Point. Later. We are very near the end, but have not and will not lose our good cheer. We have 4 days of storm in our tent, and nowhere's food or fuel. We did intend to finish ourselves when things proved like this, but we have decided to die naturally in the track. The following extracts are from letters written to other friends. I want to tell you that I was not too old for this job. It was the younger men that went under first. After all, we are setting a good example to our countrymen, if not by getting into a tight place, by facing it like men when we were there. We could have come through had we neglected the sick. Wilson, the best fellow that ever stepped, has sacrificed himself again and again to the sick men of the party. Our journey has been the biggest on record, and nothing but the most exceptional hard luck at the end would have caused us to fail to return. What lots and lots I could tell you of this journey. How much better has it been than lounging in too great comfort at home. Message to the public. The causes of the disaster are not due to faulty organisation, but to misfortune in all risks which had to be undertaken. 1. The loss of pony transport in March 1911 obliged me to start later than I had intended, and obliged the limits of stuff transported to be narrowed. 2. The weather throughout the outward journey, and especially the long gale in 83° south, stopped us. 3. The soft snow in lower reaches of glacier again reduced pace. We fought these untoward events with a will and conquered, but it cut into our provision reserve. Every detail of our food supplies, clothing and depots made on the interior ice sheet, and over that long stretch of 700 miles to the Pole and back, worked out to perfection. The advance party would have returned to the glacier in fine form, and with surplus of food, but for the astonishing failure of the man whom we had least expected to fail. Edgar Evans was thought the strongest man of the party. The Beardmore Glacier is not difficult in fine weather, but on our return we did not get a single completely fine day. This, with a sick companion, enormously increased our anxieties. As I have said elsewhere, we got into frightfully rough ice, and Edgar Evans received a concussion of the brain. He died a natural death, but left us a shaken party, with the season unduly advanced. But all the facts above enumerated were as nothing to the surprise which awaited us on the Barrier. I maintain that our arrangements for returning were quite adequate, and that no one in the world would have expected the temperatures and surfaces which we encountered at this time of the year. On the summit, in latitude 85° to 86°, we had -20 to -30°. On the Barrier, in latitude 82°, 10,000 feet lower, we had -30° in the day, -47° at night pretty regularly, with continuous headwind during our day marches. It is clear that these circumstances came on very suddenly, and our wreck is certainly due to this sudden advent of severe weather, which does not seem to have any satisfactory cause. I do not think human beings ever came through such a month as we have come through, and we should have got through, in spite of the weather, but for the sickening of a second companion, Captain Oates, and a shortage of fuel in our depots, for which I cannot account, and finally, but for the storm which has fallen on us within 11 miles of the depot at which we hope to secure our final supplies. Surely misfortune could scarcely have exceeded this last blow. We arrived within 11 miles of our old 1-ton camp, with fuel for one last meal and food for 2 days. For 4 days we have been unable to leave the tent, the gale howling about us. We are weak, writing is difficult, but for my own sake I do not regret this journey, which has shown that Englishmen can endure hardships, help one another, and meet death with as great a fortitude as ever in the past. We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last. But if we have been willing to give our lives to this enterprise, which is for the honour of our country, I appeal to our countrymen to see that those who depend on us are properly cared for. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes, and our dead bodies, must tell the tale. But surely, such a great, rich country like ours will see that those who are dependent on us are properly provided for. R. Scott. End of Chapter 18, Part 2. Chapter 19, Part 1 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 2, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, Never Again, Part 1. And now in age I bud again, after so many deaths I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain, and relish versing, oh, my only light. It cannot be that I am he, on whom thy tempests fell all night. Herbert. I shall inevitably be asked for a word of mature judgment of the expedition, of a kind that was impossible when we were all close up to it, and when I was a subaltern of 24, not incapable of judging my elders, but too young to have found out whether my judgment was worth anything. I now see very plainly that, though we achieved a first-rate tragedy, which will never be forgotten just because it was a tragedy, tragedy was not our business. In the broad perspective opened up by 10 years' distance, I see not one journey to the Pole, but two, in startling contrast one to another. On the one hand, Amundsen going straight there, getting there first, and returning without the loss of a single man, and without having put any greater strain on himself and his men than was all in the day's work of polar exploration. Nothing more businesslike could be imagined. On the other hand, our expedition, running appalling risks, performing prodigies of superhuman endurance, achieving immortal renown, commemorated in august cathedral sermons and by public statues, yet reaching the Pole only to find our terrible journey superfluous, and leaving our best men dead on the ice. To ignore such a contrast would be ridiculous. To write a book without accounting for it, a waste of time. First, let me do full justice to Amundsen. I have not attempted to disguise how we felt towards him when, after leading us to believe that he had equipped the Fram for an Arctic journey and sailed for the north, he suddenly made his dash for the south. Nothing makes a more unpleasant impression than a feint. But when Scott reached the Pole, only to find that Amundsen had been there a month before him, his distress was not that of a schoolboy who has lost a race. I have described what it had cost Scott and his 4 companions to get to the Pole, and what they had still to suffer in returning until death stopped them. Much of that risk and racking toil had been undertaken that men might learn what the world is like at the spot where the sun does not decline in the heavens, where a man loses his orbit and turns like a joint on a spit, and where his face, however he turns, is always to the north. The moment Scott saw the Norwegian tent, he knew that he had nothing to tell that was not already known. His achievement was a mere precaution against Amundsen perishing on his way back, and that risk was no greater than his own. The polar journey was literally laid waste. That was the shock that staggered them. Well might Bowers be glad to see the last of Norski's tracks as their homeward paths diverged. All this heart sickness has passed away now, and the future explorer will not concern himself with it. He will ask, what was the secret of Amundsen's slick success? What is the moral of our troubles and losses? I will take Amundsen's success first. Undoubtedly, the very remarkable qualities of the man himself had a good deal to do with it. There is a sort of sagacity that constitutes the specific genius of the explorer, and Amundsen proved his possession of this by his guess that there was terra firma in the Bay of Whales, as solid as on Ross Island. Then there is the quality of big leadership, which is shown by daring to take a big chance. Amundsen took a very big one indeed, when he turned from the route to the Pole, explored and ascertained by Scott and Shackleton, and determined to find a second pass over the mountains from the Barrier to the plateau. As it happened, he succeeded, and established his route as the best way to the Pole until a better is discovered. But he might easily have failed and perished in the attempt, and the combination of reasoning and daring that nerved him to make it can hardly be overrated. All these things helped him. Yet any rather conservative whaling captain might have refused to make Scott's experiment with motor transport, ponies and man-hauling, and stuck to the dogs, and to the use of ski in running these dogs, and it was this quite commonplace choice that sent Amundsen so gaily to the Pole and back, with no abnormal strain on men or dogs, and no great hardship either. He never pulled a mile from start to finish. The very ease of the exploit makes it impossible to infer from it that Amundsen's expedition was more highly endowed in personal qualities than ours. We did not suffer from too little brains or daring. We may have suffered from too much. We were primarily a great scientific expedition, with the Pole as our bait for public support, though it was not more important than any other acre of the plateau. We followed in the steps of a polar expedition which brought back more results than any of its forerunners, Scott's Discovery Voyage. We had the largest and most efficient scientific staff that ever left England. We were discursive. We were full of intellectual interests and curiosities of all kinds. We took on the work of 2 or 3 expeditions. It is obvious that there are disadvantages in such a division of energy. Scott wanted to reach the Pole, a dangerous and laborious exploit, but a practicable one. Wilson wanted to obtain the egg of the Emperor penguin, a horribly dangerous and inhumanly exhausting feat, which is none the less impracticable because the 3 men who achieved it survived by a miracle. These 2 feats had to be piled one on top of the other. What with the depot journey and others, in addition to these 2, we were sledged out by the end of our second sledging season, and our worst year was still to come. We, the survivors, went in search of the dead when there was a possibly living party waiting in the ice somewhere for us to succour them. That turned out all right, because when we got back we found Campbell's party self-extricated and waiting for us, alive and well. But suppose they also had perished, what would have been said of us? The practical man of the world has plenty of criticism of the way things were done. He says dogs should have been taken, but he does not show how they could have been got up and down the Beardmore. He is scandalised because 30 pounds of geological specimens were deliberately added to the weight of the sledge that was dragging the life out of the men who had to haul it. But he does not realise that it is the friction surfaces of the snow on the runners which mattered, and not the dead weight, which in this case was almost negligible. Nor does he know that these same specimens dated a continent and may elucidate the whole history of plant life. He will admit that we were all very wonderful, very heroic, very beautiful and devoted, that our exploits gave a glamour to our expedition that Amundsen's cannot claim, but he has no patience with us, and declares that Amundsen was perfectly right in refusing to allow science to use up the forces of his men, or to interfere for a moment with his single business of getting to the Pole and back again. No doubt he was, but we were not out for a single business. We were out for everything we could add to the world's store of knowledge about the Antarctic. Of course the whole business simply bristles with ifs. If Scott had taken dogs and succeeded in getting them up the Beardmore, if we had not lost those ponies on the depot journey, if the dogs had not been taken so far and the 1-ton depot had been laid, if a pony and some extra oil had been depôted on the Barrier, if a 4-man party had been taken to the Pole, if I had disobeyed my instructions and gone on from 1 ton, killing dogs as necessary, or even if I had just gone on a few miles and left some food and fuel under a flag upon a cairn. If they had been first at the pole, if it had been any other season but that. But always the bare fact remains that Scott could not have travelled from McMurdo Sound to the pole faster than he did, except with dogs. All the king's horses and all the king's men could not have done it. Why then, says the practical man, did we go to McMurdo Sound instead of to the Bay of Whales? Because we gained that continuity of scientific observation which is so important in this work, and because the Sound was the starting point for continuing the exploration of the only ascertained route to the pole via the Beardmore Glacier. I am afraid it was all inevitable. We were as wise as anyone can be before the event. I admit that we, scrupulously economical of our pemmican, were terribly prodigal of our manpower. But we had to be. The draft, whatever it may have been on the whole, was not excessive at any given point, and anyhow we just had to use every man to take every opportunity. There is so much to do, and the opportunities for doing it are so rare. Generally speaking, I don't see how we could have done differently, but I don't want to see it done again. I don't want it to be necessary to do it again. I want to see this country tackle the job and send enough men to do one thing at a time. They do it in Canada. Why not in England too? But we wasted our manpower in one way which could have been avoided. I have described how every emergency was met by calling for volunteers, and how the volunteers were always forthcoming. Unfortunately, volunteering was relied on not only for emergencies, but for a good deal of everyday work that should have been organised as routine, and the inevitable result was that the willing horses were overworked. It was a point of honour not to cacanny. Men were allowed to do too much, and were told afterwards that they had done too much, and that is not discipline. They should not have been allowed to do too much. Until our last year we never insisted on a regular routine. Money was scarce. Probably Scott could not have obtained the funds for the expedition if its objective had not been the pole. There was no lack of the things which could be bought across the counter from big business houses. All landing, sledging and scientific equipment was first class, but one of the first and most important items, the ship, would have sent Columbus on strike, and nearly sent us to the bottom of the sea. People talk of the niggardly equipment of Columbus when he sailed west from the Canaries to try a short cut to an inhabited continent of magnificent empires, as he thought, but his 3 ships were, relatively to the resources of that time, much better than the one old tramp in which we sailed, for a desert of ice in which the evening and morning are the year and not the day, and in which not even polar bears and reindeers can live. Amundsen had the Fram, built for polar exploration, ad hoc. Scott had the Discovery. But when one thinks of these Nimrods and Terra Novas, picked up second hand in the wooden ship market, and faked up for the transport of ponies, dogs, motors, and all the impedimenta of polar expedition, to say nothing of the men who have to try and do scientific work inside them, one feels disposed to clamour for a Polar Factory Act, making it a crime to ship men for the ice in vessels more fit to ply between London Bridge and Ramsgate. And then the begging that is necessary to obtain even this equipment. Shackleton hanging round the doors of rich men. Scott writing begging letters for months together. Is the country not ashamed? Modern civilized states should make up their minds to the endowment of research, which includes exploration, and as all states benefit alike by the scientific side of it, there is plenty of scope for international arrangement, especially in a region where the mere grabbing of territory is meaningless, and no foreign office can trace the frontier between King Edward's Plateau and King Haakon's. The Antarctic continent is still mostly unexplored, but enough is known of it to put any settlement by ordinary pioneer emigration, Pilgrim Fathers and the like, out of the question. Ross Island is not a place for a settlement, it is a place for an elaborately equipped scientific station with a staff in residence for a year at a time. Our stay of 3 years was far too much. Another year would have driven the best of us mad. Of the 5 main journeys which fell to my lot, one, the winter journey, should not have been undertaken at all with our equipment, and 2 others, the dog journey and the search journey, had better have been done by fresh men. It is no use repeating that Englishmen will respond to every call and stick it to the death. They will, some of them, but they have to pay the price all the same. and the price in my case was an overdraft on my vital capital which I shall never quite pay off, and in the case of 5 bigger, stronger, more seasoned men, death. The establishment of such stations and of such a service cannot be done by individual heroes and enthusiasts cadging for cheques from rich men and grants from private scientific societies. It is a business, like the NAR's Arctic Expedition, for public organisation. I do not suppose that in these days of aviation the next visit to the Pole will be made by men on foot dragging sledges, or by men on sledges dragged by dogs, mules or ponies, nor will depots be laid in that way. The pack will not, I hope, be broken through by any old coal-burning ship that can be picked up in the second-hand market. Specially built ships, and enough of them, specially engined tractors and aeroplanes, specially trained men and plenty of them, will all be needed if the work is to be done in any sort of humane and civilized fashion, and cabinet ministers and voters alike must learn to value knowledge that is not baited by suffering and death. My own bolt is shot. I do not suppose I shall ever go south again before I go west, but if I do it will be under proper and reasonable conditions. I may not come back a hero, but I shall come back none the worse, for I repeat, the Antarctic, in moderation as to length of stay, and with such accommodation as is now easily within the means of modern civilized powers, is not half as bad a place for public service as the worst military stations on the equator. I hope that by the time Scott comes home, for he is coming home, the Barrier is moving, and not a trace of our funeral cairn was found by Shackleton's men in 1916. The hardships that wasted his life will be only a horror of the past, and his Via Dolorosa a highway as practicable as Piccadilly. And now let me come down to tin tacks. No matter how well the thing is done in future, its organisers will want to know at first all we can tell them about oil, about coal, and about food. First, as to oil. Scott complains of a shortage of oil at several of his last depots. There is no doubt that this shortage was due to the perishing of the leather washers of the tins which contained the paraffin oil. All these tins had been subjected to the warmth of the sun in summer and the autumn temperatures, which were unexpectedly cold. In his voyage of the Discovery, Scott wrote as follows of the tins in which they drew their oil when sledging. Each tin had a small cork bung, which was a decided weakness. Paraffin creeps in the most annoying manner, and a good deal of oil was wasted this way, especially when the sledges were travelling over rough ground and were shaken or, as frequently happened, capsized. It was impossible to make these bungs quite tight, however closely they were jammed down, so that in spite of a trifling extra weight, a much better fitting would have been a metallic screwed bung. To find, on opening a fresh tin of oil, that it was only 3 parts full was very distressing, and of course meant that the cooker had to be used with still greater care. Amundsen wrote of his paraffin, "We kept it in the usual cans, but they proved too weak. Not that we lost any paraffin, but Bjaaland had to be constantly soldering to keep them tight." Our own tins were furnished with the metallic screwed stoppers, which Scott recommended. There was no trouble reported until we came up to One Ton Camp when on the search journey. Here was the depot of food and oil which I had laid in the previous autumn for the Polar Party, stowed in a canvas tank which was buried beneath 7 feet of snow. The oil was placed on the top of the snow in order that the red tins might prove an additional mark for the depot. When we dug out the tank, the food inside was almost uneatable, owing to the quantity of paraffin which had found its way down through 7 feet of snow during the winter and spring. We then found the Polar Party and learned of the shortage of oil. After our return to Cape Evans, someone was digging about the camp and came across a wooden case containing 8 one-gallon tins of paraffin. These had been placed there in September 1911, to be landed at Cape Crozier by the Terra Nova when she came down. The ship could not take them. They were snowed up during the winter, lost and forgotten, until dug up 15 months afterwards. 3 tins were full, 3 empty, 1 1/3 full, and 1 2/3 full. There can be no doubt that the oil, which was specially volatile, tended to vaporize and escape through the stoppers, and that this process was accelerated by the perishing, and I suggest also the hardening and shrinking of the leather washers. Another expedition will have to be very careful on this point. They might reduce the risk by burying the oil. End of chapter 19, part 1. Chapter 19, Part 2 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 2, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, Never Again, Part 2. The second point about which something must be said is the unexpected cold met by Scott on the Barrier, which was the immediate cause of the disaster. No one in the world would have expected the temperatures and surfaces which we encountered at this time of the year. It is clear that these circumstances came on very suddenly, and our wreck is certainly due to this sudden advent of severe weather, which does not seem to have any satisfactory cause. They came down the glacier in plus temperatures, nor was there anything abnormal for more than a week after they got on to the Barrier. Then there came a big drop to a -37° minimum on the night of February 26th. It is significant that the sun began to dip below the southern horizon at midnight about this time. "There is no doubt the middle of the Barrier is a pretty awful locality," wrote Scott. Simpson, in his meteorological report, has little doubt that the temperatures met by the Polar Party were abnormal. The records clearly bring to light the possibility of great cold at an extremely early period in the year, within a comparatively few miles of an open sea, where the temperatures were over 40 degrees higher. It is quite impossible to believe that normally there is a difference of nearly 40 degrees in March between McMurdo Sound and the south of the Barrier. The temperatures recorded by other sledge parties in March 1912, and those recorded at Cape Evans from additional evidence in Simpson's opinion that the temperatures experienced by Scott were not such as might be expected during normal autumn weather. Simpson's explanation is based upon the observations made in McMurdo Sound by sending up balloons with self-recording instruments attached. These showed that very rapid radiation takes place from the snow surface in winter, which cools the air in the immediate neighbourhood. A cold layer of air is thus formed near the ground, which may be many degrees colder than the air above it. It becomes, as it were, colder than it ought to be. This, however, can only happen during an absence of wind. When a wind blows, the cold layer is swept away, the air is mixed, and the temperature rises. The absence of wind from the south noted by Scott was, in Simpson's opinion, the cause of the low temperatures met by Scott. The temperature was reduced 10 degrees below normal at Cape Evans, and perhaps 20 degrees where Scott was. The third question is that of food. It is this point which is most important to future explorers. It is a fact that the Polar Party failed to make their distance because they became weak, and that they became weak although they were eating their full ration or more than their full ration of food, save for a few days when they went short on the way down the Beardmore Glacier. The first man to weaken was the biggest and heaviest man in the expedition, the man whom we had least expected to fail. The rations were of two kinds. The Barrier B ration was that which was used on the Barrier during the outward journey towards the Pole. The Summit S ration was the result of our experiments on the winter journey. I expect it is the best ration which has been used to date, and consisted of biscuits 16, pemmican 12, butter 2, cocoa 0.57, sugar 3, and tea 0.86 ounces. Total 34.43 ounces daily per man. The 12 men who went forward started this S ration at the foot of the Beardmore, and it was this ration which was left in all depots to see them home. It was much more satisfying than the Barrier ration, and men could not have eaten so much when leading ponies or driving dogs in the early stages of summer Barrier sledging, but man-hauling is a different business altogether from leading ponies or driving dogs. It is calculated that the body requires certain proportions of fat, carbohydrates and proteins to do certain work under certain conditions. But just what the absolute quantities are is not ascertained. The work of the Polar Party was laborious. The temperatures, the most important of the conditions, varied from comparative warmth up and down the glacier to an average of about -20 degrees in the rarefied air of the plateau. The temperatures met by them on their return over the Barrier were not really low for more than a week, and then there came quite commonly -30s during the day, with a further drop to -40s at night, when for a time the sun was below the horizon. These temperatures, which are not very terrible to men who are fresh and whose clothing is new, were ghastly to these men who had striven night and day almost ceaselessly for 4 months on, as I maintain, insufficient food. Did these temperatures kill them? Undoubtedly the low temperatures caused their death, inasmuch as they would have lived had the temperatures remained high. But Evans would not have lived. He died before the low temperatures occurred. What killed Evans, and why did the other men weaken as they did, though they were eating full rations and more? Weaken so much that in the end they starved to death. I have always had a doubt whether the weather conditions were sufficient to cause the tragedy. These men on full rations were supposed to be eating food of sufficient value to enable them to do the work they were doing, under the conditions which they actually met until the end of February, without loss of strength. They had more than their full rations, but the conditions in March were much worse than they imagined to be possible. When 3 survivors out of the 5 pitched their last camp, they were in a terrible state. After the war I found that Atkinson had come to wonder much as I, but he had gone farther, for he had the values of our rations worked out by a chemical expert according to the latest knowledge and standards. I may add that, being in command after Scott's death, he increased the ration for the next year's sledging, so I suppose he had already come to the conclusion that the previous ration was not sufficient. The following are some of the data for which I am indebted to him. The whole subject will be investigated by him and the results published in a more detailed form. According to the most modern standards, the food requirements for laborious work at a temperature of 0 Fahrenheit, which is a fair Barrier average temperature to take, are 7,714 calories, to produce 10,069 foot-tons of work. The actual Barrier ration which we used would generate 4,003 calories, equivalent to 5,331 foot-tons of work. Similar requirements for laborious work at -10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a high average plateau temperature, are 8,500 calories to produce 11,094 foot-tons of work. The actual summit ration would generate 4,889 calories, equivalent to 6,608 foot-tons of work. These requirements are calculated for total absorption of all foodstuffs, but in practice, by visual proof, this does not take place. This is especially noticeable in the case of fats, a quantity of which were digested neither by men, ponies, nor dogs. Several things go to prove that our ration was not enough. In the first case, we were probably not as fit as we seemed after long sledge journeys. There is no doubt that when sledging, men developed an automaticity of certain muscles at the expense of other muscles. For instance, a sledge could be hauled all day at the expense of the arms, and we had little power to lift weights at the end of several months of sledging. In relation to this I would add that when the relief ship arrived in February 1912, 4 of us were at Cape Evans, but just arrived from 3 months of the polar journey. The land party, we 4 among them, were turned on to sledge stores ashore. This in practice meant 20 miles every day, dragging a sledge, a good deal of humping heavy cases from 5 o'clock in the morning to very late at night, with uncertain meals and no rests. I can remember now how hard that work was to myself, and I expect to those others who had been away sledging. The ship's party sledged only every other day, because they were not used to it. This was extremely bad organisation, and in view of the possibility that some of the men might be required for further sledging in the autumn, just silly. Again, there is the experience of the man-hauling parties of the polar journey. There was, you may remember, a man-hauling party on the way to the Beardmore Glacier. They travelled with a light sledge, but they lost weight on the Barrier ration. It is significant that they picked up condition when they started the summit ration, especially Lashley. The polar party and the 2 returning parties who were on the summit ration from the foot of the Beardmore until the end of their journeys weakened, in Atkinson's opinion, more than they should have done had their ration been sufficient. The first return party covered approximately 1,100 statute miles. At the end of their journey their pulling muscles were all right, but Atkinson, who led the party, considers that they were at least 70% weaker in other muscles. They all lost a great deal of weight, though they had the best conditions of the 3 returning parties, and the temperatures met by them averaged well over 0. The second return party faced much worse conditions. They were only 3 men, and one of the 3 was so sick that for 120 miles he could not pull, and for 90 miles he had to be dragged on the sledge. The average temperature approximated 0. They were extremely exhausted. Scott makes constant reference to the increasing hunger of the Polar Party. It is clear that the food did not compensate for the conditions which were met in increasing severity. Yet they were eating rather more than their full ration a considerable part of the time. It has to be considered that the temperatures met by them averaged far below -10 degrees, that they did not absorb all their food, that increased heat was wanted, not only for energy to do extra work caused by bad surfaces and contrary winds, but also to heat their bodies, and to thaw out their clothing and sleeping bags. I believe it to be clear that the rations used by us must not only be increased by future expeditions, but co-ordinated in different proportions of fats, proteins and carbohydrates. Taking into consideration the fact that our bodies were not digesting the amount of fats we had provided, Atkinson suggests that it is useless to increase the fats at the expense of the protein and carbohydrates. He recommends that fats should total about 5 ounces daily. The digestion of carbohydrates is easy and complete, and though that of protein is more complicated, there are plenty of the necessary digestive ferments. The ration should be increased by equal amounts of protein and carbohydrates. Both should be provided in as dry and pure a form as possible. There is no censure attached to this criticism. Our ration was probably the best which had been used, but more is known now than was known then. We are all out to try and get these things right for the future. Campbell reached Hut Point only 5 days after we left it with the dog teams. A characteristic note left to greet us on our return regretted they were too late to take part in the search journey. If I had lived through 10 months such as those men had just endured, wild horses would not have dragged me out sledging again, but they were keen to get some useful work done in the time which remained until the ship arrived. We had the polar records. Campbell and his men, unaided, had not only survived their terrible winter, but had sledged down the coast after it. We ourselves, faced by a difficult alternative, had fallen on our feet. We never hoped for more than this. We seldom hoped for so much. I wanted a series of Adelie penguin embryos from the rookery at Cape Royds, but had not expected an opportunity of getting them because I was away sledging during the summer months. Now the chance had come. Atkinson wanted to work on parasites at the same place, and others to survey. But the real job was an ascent of Erebus, the active volcano which rose from our doors to some 13,400 feet in height. A party of Shackleton's men under Professor David went up it in March, and managed to haul a sledge up to 5,800 feet, from which point they had to portage their gear. A year before this, Debenham, with the help of a telescope, selected a route by which they could haul a sledge up to 9,000 feet. There proved to be no great difficulty about it. It was just a matter of legs and breath. They were a cheery company, part singing in the evenings and working hard all day. It was an uneventful trip, Debenham said, and very harmonious. The best trip he had down there. Both Debenham and Dickerson suffered from mountain sickness, however, and they were the two smokers. The clearness of the air was marked. At 5,000 feet they could plainly see Mount Melbourne and Cape Jones, between 200 and 300 miles away, and several uncharted mountains over to the west, but they were unable to plot them accurately because they could get direction rays from one point only. The Sound itself was covered by cloud most of the time, but Beaufort Island and Franklin Island were clear. Unlike David's party, they could see no signs whatever of volcanic action on Mount Bird, which is almost entirely covered with ice, on which it was to be expected that some mark might be left. At 9,000 feet Terror looked very imposing, but Mount Bird and Terra Nova were insignificant and uninteresting. The valley between the old crater and the slopes of the second crater greatly impressed them, and they found a fine little crevassed glacier on it. Both Priestley and Debenham are of opinion that it is possible to get to Terror by this valley, and that there are no crevassed areas or impossible slopes on the way. All the same, it would probably be more sensible to go from Cape Crozier. At a point about 9,000 feet up, Priestley, Gran, Abbott and Hooper started to make the ascent to the active crater on December 10th. They packed the tent, poles, bags, inner cooker and cooking gear, with 4 days' provisions, and reached the second crater at about 11,500 feet to be hung up by cloud all the next day. At these altitudes the temperature varied between -10 degrees and -30 degrees, although at sea level simultaneously they were around about freezing point. By 1 a.m. on the 12th the conditions were good, clear, with a southerly wind blowing the steam away from the summit. The party got away as soon as possible and reached the lip of the active crater in a few hours. Looking down they were unable to see the bottom, for it was full of steam. The sides sloped at a steep angle for some 500 feet, when they became sheer precipices. The opening appeared to be about 14,000 paces round. The top is mostly pumice, but there is also a lot of kenyte, much the same as at sea level. The old crater was mostly kenyte, proving that this is the oldest rock of the island. Felspar crystals must be continually thrown out, for they were lying about on the top of the snow. I have one nearly 3½ inches long. 2 men went back to the camp, for one had a frostbitten foot. This left Priestley and Gran, who tried to boil the hypsometer but failed owing to the wind, which was variable and enveloped them from time to time in steam and sulphur vapour. They left a record on a cairn and started to return. But when they had got 500 feet down, Priestley found that he had left a tin of exposed films on the top instead of the record. Gran said he would go back and change it. He had reached the top when there was a loud explosion. Large blocks of pumice were hurled out with a big smoke cloud. Probably a big bubble had burst. Gran was in the middle of it, heard it gurgle before it burst, saw blocks of pumiceous lava in shape like the halves of volcanic bombs, with bunches of long drawn-out hair like shreds of glass in their interior. This was Pellé's hair. Gran was a bit sick from sulphur dioxide fumes afterwards. They reached Cape Royds on the 16th, the very successful trip taking 15 days. Meanwhile Shackleton's old hut was very pleasant at this time of year. In winter it was a bit too draughty. With bright sunlight, a lop on the sea which splashed and gurgled under the ice foot, the beautiful mountains all around us and the penguins nesting at our door, this was better than the Beardmore Glacier, where we had expected to be at this date. What then must it have been to the 6 men who were just returned from the very gates of hell? And the food. Truly Shackleton's men must have fed like turkey cocks from all the delicacies here. Boiled chicken, kidneys, mushroom, ginger, Garibaldi biscuits, soups of all kinds. It is a splendid change. Best of all are the fresh buttered skewers eggs which we make for breakfast. In fact, life is bearable, with all that has been unknown so long at last cleared up, and our anxieties for Campbell's party laid at rest. End of chapter 19, part 2. Chapter 19, Part 3 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 2, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, Never Again, Part 3. For 3 weeks I worked among the Adélie penguins at Cape Royds and obtained a complete series of their embryos. It was always Wilson's idea that embryology was the next job of a vertebral zoologist down south. I have already explained that the penguin is an interesting link in the evolutionary chain, and the object of getting this embryo is to find out where the penguins come in. Whether or no they are more primitive than other non-flying birds, such as the apteryx, the ostrich, the rhea and the moa, which last is only just extinct, is an open question. But wingless birds are still hanging on to the promontories of the southern continents, where there is less rivalry than in the highly populated land areas of the north. It may be that penguins are descended from ancestors who lived in the northern hemisphere in a winged condition. Even now you may sometimes see them try to fly, and that they have been driven towards the south. If penguins are primitive, it is rational to infer that the most primitive penguin is farthest south. These are the 2 Antarcticists, the Emperor and the Adélie. The latter appears to be the more numerous and successful of the 2, and for this reason we are inclined to search among the Emperors as being among the most primitive penguins, if not the most primitive of birds now living. Hence the winter journey. I was glad to get, in addition, this series of Adélie penguins' embryos, feeling somewhat like a giant who had wandered on to the wrong planet, and who was distinctly in the way of its true inhabitants. We returned too late to see the eggs laid, and therefore it was impossible to tell how old the embryos were. My hopes rose, however, when I saw some eggless nests with penguins sitting upon them, but later I found that these were used as bachelor quarters by birds whose wives were sitting near. I tried taking eggs from nests, and was delighted to find that new eggs appeared. These I carefully marked, and it was not until I opened one 2 days later to find inside an embryo at least 2 weeks old that I realised that penguins added baby snatching to their other immoralities. Some of those from whom I took eggs sat upon stones of a similar size and shape, with every appearance of content. One sat upon the half of the red tin of a Dutch cheese. They are not very intelligent. All the world loves a penguin. I think it is because in many respects they are like ourselves, and in some respects what we should like to be. Had we but half their physical courage, none could stand against us. Had we 100th part of their maternal instinct, we should have to kill our children by the 1,000. Their little bodies are so full of curiosity that they have no room for fear. They like mountaineering and joy-riding on ice floes. They even like to drill. One day there had been a blizzard, and lying open to the view of all was a deserted nest, a pile of coveted stones. All the surrounding rookery made their way to and fro, each husband acquiring merit, for, after each journey, he gave his wife a stone. This was the plebeian way of doing things, but my friend who stood, ever so unconcerned, upon a rock, knew a trick worth 2 of that. He and his wife, who sat so cosily upon the other side. The victim was a third penguin. He was without a mate, but this was an opportunity to get one. With all the speed his little legs could compass, he ran to and fro, taking stones from the deserted nest, laying them beneath a rock, and hurrying back for more. On that same rock was my friend. When the victim came up with his stone, he had his back turned, but as soon as the stone was laid and the other gone for more, he jumped down, seized it with his beak, ran round, gave it to his wife, and was back on the rock, with his back turned, before you could say killer whale. Every now and then he looked over his shoulder to see where the next stone might be. I watched this for 20 minutes. All that time, and I do not know for how long before, the wretched bird was bringing stone after stone, and there were no stones there. Once he looked puzzled, looked up and swore at the back of my friend on his rock, but immediately he came back, and he never seemed to think he had better stop. It was getting cold, and I went away. He was coming for another. The life of the Adélie penguin is one of the most unchristian and successful in the world. The penguin which went in for being a true believer would never stand the ghost of a chance. Watch them go to bathe. Some 50 or 60 agitated birds are gathered upon the ice foot, peering over the edge, telling one another how nice it will be, and what a good dinner they are going to have. But this is all swank. They are really worried by the horrid suspicion that a sea leopard is waiting to eat the first to dive. The really noble bird, according to our theories, would say, "I will go first, and if I am killed I shall at any rate have died unselfishly, sacrificing my life for my companions." And in time all the most noble birds would be dead. What they really do is to try and persuade a companion of weaker mind to plunge. Failing this, they hastily pass a conscription act and push him over. And then, bang, helter-skelter, in go all the rest. They take turns in sitting on their eggs, and after many days the fathers may be seen waddling down towards the sea with their shirt-fronts muddied, their long trick done. It may be a fortnight before they return, well-fed, clean, pleased with life, and with a grim determination to relieve their wives to do their job. Sometimes they are met by others going to bathe. They stop and pass the time of day. Well, perhaps it would be more pleasant, and what does a day or 2 matter anyhow? They turn. Clean and dirty alike are off to the seaside again. This is when they say, "The women are splendid." Life is too strenuous for them to have any use for the virtues of brotherly love, good works, charity, and benevolence. Whenever they mate, the best thief wins. When they nest, the best pair of thieves hatch out their eggs. In a long, unbroken stream, which stretches down below the sea ice horizon, they march in from the open sea. Some are walking on their human feet, others tobogganing upon their shiny white breasts. After their long walk they must have a sleep, and then the gentlemen make their way into the already crowded rookery to find them wives. But first a suitor must find or steal a pebble, for such are the penguin jewels. They are of lava, black, russet or grey, with almond-shaped crystals bedded in them. They are rare and of all sizes, but that which is most valued is the size of a pigeon's egg. Armed with one of these he courts his maid, laying it at her feet. If accepted, he steals still more stones. She guards them jealously, taking the meantime any safe opportunity to pick others from under her nearest neighbours. Any penguin which is unable to fight and steal successfully fails to make a good high nest, or loses it when made. Then comes a blizzard, and after that a thaw, for it thaws sometimes right down by the seashore where the Adelies have their nurseries. The eggs of the strong and wicked hatch out, but those of the weak are addled. You must have a jolly good pile of stones to hatch eggs after a blizzard like that in December 1911, when rookeries were completely snow-covered, nests, eggs, parents and all. Once hatched, the chicks grow quickly from pretty grey atoms of down to black lumps of stomach topped by a small and quite inadequate head. They are 2 or more weeks old, and they leave their parents, or their parents leave them, I do not know which. If socialism be the nationalisation of the means of production and distribution, then they are socialists. They divide into parents and children. The adult community comes up from the open sea, bringing food inside them. They are full of half-digested shrimps, but not for their own children. These, if not already dead, are lost in a crowd of hungry tottering infants, which besiege each food provider as he arrives. But not all of them can get food, though all of them are hungry. Some have already been behindhand too long. They have not managed to secure food for days, and they are weak and cold and very weary. As we stood there and watched this race for food, we were gradually possessed with the idea that the chicks looked upon each adult coming up full-bellied from the shore as not a parent only, but a food supply. The parents were labouring under a totally different idea, and intended either to find their own infants and feed them, or else to assimilate their already partially digested catch themselves. The more robust of the young thus worried an adult until, because of his importunity, he was fed. But with the less robust, a much more pathetic ending was the rule. A chick that had fallen behind in this literal race for life, starving and weak, and getting daily weaker because it could not run fast enough to insist on being fed, again and again ran off, pursuing with the rest. Again and again it stumbled and fell, persistently whining out its hunger in a shrill and melancholy pipe, till at last the race was given up. Forced thus by sheer exhaustion to stop and rest, it had no chance of getting food. Each hurrying parent, with its little following of hungry chicks, intent on one thing only, rushed quickly by, and the starveling dropped behind to gather strength for one more effort. Again it fails. A robuster bird has forced the pace, and again success is wanting to the runt. Sleepily it stands there, with half-shut eyes, in a torpor resulting from exhaustion, cold and hunger, wondering perhaps what all the bustle round it means. A little dirty, dishevelled dot in the race for life, a failure, deserted by its parents, who have hunted vainly for their own offspring round the nest in which they hatched it, but from which it may by now have wandered half a mile. And so it stands, lost to everything around, till a skewer in its beat drops down beside it, and with a few strong, vicious pecks, puts an end to the failing life. There is a great deal to be said for this kind of treatment. The Adelie penguin has a hard life. The emperor penguin a horrible one. Why not kill off the unfit right away before they have had time to breed, almost before they have had time to eat? Life is a stern business in any case. Why pretend that it is anything else, or that any but the best can survive at all? And in consequence I challenge you to find a more jolly, happy, healthy lot of old gentlemen in the world. We must admire them, if only because they are so much nicer than ourselves. But it is grim. Nature is an uncompromising nurse. Nature was going to give us a bad time too, if we were not relieved, and on January 17th, as there were still no signs of the ship, it was decided to prepare for another winter. We were to go on rations, to cook with oil, for nearly all the coal was gone, to kill and store up a seal. On January 18th we started our preparations, digging a cave to store more meat and so forth. I went off seal hunting after breakfast, and having killed and cut up 2, came back across the cape at midday. All the men were out working in the camp. There was nothing to be seen in the Sound, and then quite suddenly the bows of a ship came out from behind the end of the Barne Glacier, 2 or 3 miles away. We watched her cautious approach with immense relief. "Are you all well?" through a megaphone from the bridge. "The Polar Party died on their return from the Pole. We have their records." A pause, and then a boat. Evans, who had been to England and made a good recovery from scurvy, was in command. With him were Pennell, Rennick, Bruce, Lilly and Drake. They reported having had a very big gale indeed on their way home last year. We got some apples off the ship. Beauties, I want nothing better. Pennell is first class as always. One notices among the ship's men a rather unnatural way of talking, not so much in special instances, but as a whole. Contact with civilization gives it an affected sound. I notice it in both the officers and men. July 19th, on board the Terra Nova. After 28 hours loading, we left the old hut for good and all at 4 p.m. this afternoon. It has been a bit of a rush and little sleep last night. It is quite wonderful now to be travelling a day's journey in an hour. We went to Cape Royds in about that time and took off geological and zoological specimens. I should like to sit up and sketch all these views, which would have meant long travelling without the ship, but I feel very tired. The mail is almost too good for words. Now, with the latest waltz on the gramophone, beer for dinner, and apples and fresh vegetables to eat, life is more bearable than it has been for many a long weary week and month. I leave Cape Evans with no regret. I never want to see the place again. The pleasant memories are all swallowed up in the bad ones. Before the ship arrived, it was decided among us to urge the erection of a cross on Observation Hill to the memory of the Polar Party. On the arrival of the ship, the carpenter immediately set to work to make a great cross of jarrah wood. There was some discussion as to the inscription, it being urged that there should be some quotation from the Bible, because the women think a lot of these things. But I was glad to see the concluding line of Tennyson's Ulysses adopted: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. The open water stretched about 1.5 miles south of Tent Island, and here we left the ship to sledge across to Hut Point at 8 a.m. on January 20th. The party consisted of Atkinson, Wright, Lashley, Crean, Debenham, Keown and Davis, the ship's carpenter, and myself. Evening. Hut Point. We had a most unpleasant experience coming in. We struck wind and drift just about 1 mile from Hut Point. Then we saw there was a small thaw pool off the point, and came out to give it a wide berth. Atkinson put his feet down into the water. We turned sharp out, and then Crean was right in up to his arms, and we realised that the ice was not more than 3 or 4 inches of slush. I managed to give him a hand out without the ice giving, and we went on floundering about. Then Crean went right in again, and the sledge nearly went too. We pulled the sledge, and the sledge pulled him out. Except for some more soft patches, that was all, but it was quite enough. I think we got out of it most fortunately. Crean got some dry clothes here, and the cross has had a coat of white paint and is drying. We went up Observation Hill and have found a good spot right on the top, and have already dug a hole which will, with the rock alongside, give us 3 feet. From there we can see that this year's old ice is in a terrible state. Open water and open water slush all over near the land. I have never seen anything like it here. Off Cape Armitage and at the Pram Point pressure it is extra bad. I only hope we can find a safe way back. You would not think Crean had had such a pair of duckings to hear him talking so merrily tonight. I really do think the cross is going to look fine. Observation Hill was clearly the place for it. It knew them all so well. 3 of them were Discovery men who lived 3 years under its shadow. They had seen it time after time as they came back from hard journeys on the Barrier. Observation Hill and Castle Rock were the 2 which always welcomed them in. It commanded McMurdo Sound on one side, where they had lived, and the Barrier on the other, where they had died. No more fitting pedestal, a pedestal which in itself is nearly 1,000 feet high, could have been found. Tuesday, January 22nd. Rousing out at 6 a.m, we got the large piece of the cross up Observation Hill by 11 a.m. It was a heavy job, and the ice was looking very bad all round, and I for one was glad when we had got it up by 5 o'clock or so. It is really magnificent, and will be a permanent memorial, which could be seen from the ship 9 miles off with the naked eye. It stands 9 feet out of the rocks, and many feet into the ground, and I do not believe it will ever move. When it was up, facing out over the Barrier, we gave 3 cheers, and 1 more. End of chapter 19, part 3. Chapter 19, part 4 of The Worst Journey in the World, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, Never Again, part 4. We got back to the ship all right, and coasted up the Western Mountains to Granite Harbour, a wonderfully interesting trip to those of us who had only seen these mountains from a distance. Gran went off to pick up a depot of geological specimens. Lily did a trawl. This was an absorbing business, though it was only one of a long and important series made during the voyages of the Terra Nova. Here were all kinds of sponges, siliceous, glass rope, tubular, and they were generally covered with mucus. Some fed on diatoms so minute that they can only be collected by centrifuge. Some have gastric juices to dissolve the siliceous skeletons of the diatoms on which they feed. They anchor themselves in the mud and pass water in and out of their bodies. Sometimes the current is stimulated by cilia. There were colonies of Gorgonacea, which share their food unselfishly, and corals and marine degenerate worms which started to live in little cells like coral, but have gone down in the world, and there were starfishes, sea urchins, brittle stars, feather stars, and sea cucumbers. The sea urchins are formed of hexagonal plates, the centre of each of which is a ball, upon which a spine works on a ball and socket joint. These spines are used for protection, and when large they can be used for locomotion. But the real means of locomotion are 5 double rows of water tube feet, working by suction, by which they withdraw the water inside a receptacle in the shell, thereby forming a vacuum. Starfishes do the same. We found a species of sea urchin which had such large spines that they practically formed bars. The spines were twice as long as the sea urchin and shaped just like oars, being even fluted. A lobster grows by discarding his suit, hiding and getting another, growing meanwhile. A snail or an oyster retains his original shell and adds to it in layers all the way down, increasing one edge. But our sea urchin grows by an increment of calcareous matter all round the outside of each plate. As the animal grows the plates get bigger. There was a sea cucumber which nurses its young, having a brood cavity which is really formed out of the mouth. This is a peculiarity of a new Antarctic genus found first on the Discovery. It has the most complex water tubes, which it uses as legs, and a few limy rods in its soft skin, instead of the bony calcareous plates of sea urchins and starfish. After them came the feather stars, a relic of the old crinoids which used to flourish in the Carboniferous period, examples of which can be found in the Derbyshire limestone. And there were thousands of brittle stars, like beautiful wheels, of which the hubs and spokes remained, but not the circumference. These spokes or legs are muscular, sensory, and locomotive. They differ from the starfishes in that they have no digestive glands in their legs, and from the feather stars in that they do not use their legs to waft food into their mouths. Once upon a time they had a stalk and were anchored to a rock, and there are still very rare old stalked echinoderms living in the sea. This apparently geological thing was found by Wyville Thomson in 1868, still living in the seas to the north of Scotland, and this find started the Challenger expedition for deep sea soundings in 1872. But the Challenger brought back little in this line. Most of the species we found were peculiar to the Antarctic. There were polychaete worms by the hundred, showing the protrusible mouth, which is shoved into the mud and then brought back into the body, and the bristles on the highly developed projections, which act as legs, by which they get about the mud. These beasts have apparently given rise to the arthropods. In a modified and later form they had taken to living in a tube, both for protection and because they found that they could not go through the mud, which had become too viscous for them. So they stand up in a tube and collect the sediment which is falling by means of tentacles. They spread from one locality to another by going through a plankton embryonic stage in their youth. They may be compared to the mason worms, which also build tubes. But as Lily squatted on the poop, surrounded by an inner ring of jars and tangled masses of the catch, and an outer ring of curious scientists, pseudo-scientists and seamen, no find pleased him so much as the frequent discovery of pieces of the Cephalodiscus rarus, of which even now there are but some 4 jars full in the world. It is as interesting as it is uncommon, for its ancestor was a link between the vertebrates and invertebrates, though no one knows what it was like. It had been a vertebrate and gone back, and now has the signs of a notochord in early life, and it also has gills. First found on the Grahamsland side of the Antarctic continent, it has only recently been discovered in the Ross Sea, and occurs nowhere else in the world so far as is known. We left Granite Harbour on the early morning of January 23rd, and started to make our way out. Our next job was to pick up the geological specimens at Evans Coves, where Campbell and his men had wintered in the igloo, and also to leave a depot there for future explorers. We met a very heavy pack, having to return at least 12 miles and try another way. The sea has been freezing out here, which seems an extraordinary thing at this time of year. There was a thin layer of ice over the water between the floes this morning, and I feel sure that the most of these big level floes, of which we have seen several, are the remains of ice which has frozen comparatively recently. The propeller had a bad time, constantly catching up on ice. At length we were some 30 miles north of Cape Bird, making roughly towards Franklin Island. That night we made good progress in fairly open water, and we passed Franklin Island during the day. But the outlook was so bad in the evening, January 24th, that we stopped and banked fires. We lay just where we stopped until 5 a.m. on January 25th, when the ice eased up sufficiently for us to get along, and we started to make the same slow progress. Slow ahead, stop to the engine room, bump and grind for a bit, then slow astern, stop, slow ahead again, and so on, until at 7 p.m, after one real big bump which brought the dinner some inches off the table, Cheetham brought us out into open water. Mount Nansen rose sheer and massive ahead of us with a tabletop, and at 3 a.m. on January 26 we were passing the dark brown granite headland of the northern foothills. We were soon made fast to a stretch of some 500 yards of thick sea ice, upon which the wind had not left a particle of snow, and before us the foothills formed that opening which Campbell had well named Hell's Gate. I wish I had seen that igloo, with its black and blubber and beastliness. Those who saw it came back with faces of amazement and admiration. We left a depot at the head of the bay marked with a bamboo and a flag, and then we turned homewards, counting the weeks and days, and then the hours. In the early hours of January 27th we left the pack. On January 29th we were off Cape Adare. Head sea and wind and fog, very ticklish work, groping along, hardly seeing the ship's length. Then it lifts, and there is a fair horizon. Everybody pretty seasick, including most of the seamen from Cape Evans, all of us feeling rotten. Very thick that night, and difficult going. At midday, latitude 69 degrees 50 minutes south, a partial clearance showed a berg right ahead. By night it was blowing a full gale, and it was not too easy to keep in our bunks. Our object was now to make east in order to allow for the westerlies later on. We passed a very large number of bergs, varied every now and then by growlers. On February 1st, latitude 64 degrees 15 minutes south and longitude 159 degrees 15 minutes east, we coasted along one side of a berg which was 21 geographical miles long, the only other side of which we got a good view stretched away until lost below the horizon. In latitude 62 degrees 10 minutes south and longitude 158 degrees 15 minutes east, we had a real bad day, head wind from early morning, and simply crowds of bergs all round. At 8 a.m. we had to wedge in between a berg and a long line of pack before we could find a way through. Then thick fog came down. At 9:45 a.m. I went out of the wardroom door and almost knocked my head against a great berg which was just not touching the ship on the starboard side. There was a heavy cross swell, and the sea sounded cold as it dashed against the ice. After crossing the deck it was just possible to see in the fog that there was a great barrier berg just away on the port side. We groped around the starboard berg to find others beyond. Our friend on the opposite side was continuous and apparently without end. It was soon clear that we were in a narrow alleyway between one very large berg and a number of others. It took an hour and a quarter of groping to leave the big berg behind. At 4 p.m, 6 hours later, we were still just feeling our way along, and we had hopes of being out of the ice in this latitude. The Terra Nova is a wood barque, built in 1884 by A. Stevens and Sons, Dundee. Tonnage 764 gross and 400 net. Measuring 187 feet by 31 feet by 19 feet. Compound engines with 2 cylinders of 140 nominal horsepower. Registered at St. John's, Newfoundland. She is therefore not by any means small as polar ships go, but Pennell and his men worked her short-handed with bergs and growlers all around them, generally with a big sea running and often in darkness or fog. On this occasion we were spared many of the most ordinary dangers. It was summer. Our voyage was an easy one. There was twilight most of the night. There were plenty of men on board and heaps of coal. Imagine then what kind of time Pennell and his ship's company had in late autumn, after remaining in the south until only a bare ration of coal was left for steaming, until the sea was freezing round them, and propeller brought up dead as they tried to force their way through it. Pennell was a very sober person in his statements, yet he described the gale through which the Terra Nova passed on her way to New Zealand in March 1912 as seeming to blow the ship from the top of one wave to the top of the next, and the nights were dark and the bergs were all around them. They never tried to lay a meal in those days, they just ate what they could hold in their hands. He confessed to me that 1 hour he did begin to wonder what was going to happen next. Others told me that he seemed to enjoy every minute of it. Owing to press contracts and the necessity of preventing leakage of news, the Terra Nova had to remain at sea for 24 hours after a cable had been sent to England. Also, it was of the first importance that the relatives should be informed of the facts before the newspapers published them. And so at 2:30 a.m. on February 10th we crept like a phantom ship into the little harbour of Oamaru on the east coast of New Zealand. With what mixed feelings we smelt the old familiar woods and grassy slopes, and saw the shadowy outlines of human homes. With untiring persistence the little lighthouse blinked out the message, "What ship's that? What ship's that?" They were obviously puzzled and disturbed at getting no answer. A boat was lowered, and Pennell and Atkinson were rowed ashore and landed. The seamen had strict orders to answer no questions. After a little the boat returned, and Crean announced, "We was chased, sir, but they got nothing out of us." We put out to sea. When morning broke we could see the land in the distance, greenness, trees, every now and then a cottage. We began to feel impatient. We unpacked the shore-going clothes with their creases 3 years old, which had been sent out from home, tried them on, and they felt unpleasantly tight. We put on our boots, and they were positive agony. We shaved off our beards. There was a hiatus. There was nothing to do but sail up and down the coast, and, if possible, avoid coastwise craft. In the evening the little ship, which runs daily from Akaroa to Lyttelton, put out to sea on her way and ranged close alongside. "Are all well? Where's Captain Scott? Did you reach the Pole?" Rather unsatisfactory answers, and away they went. Our first glimpse, however, of civilized life. At dawn the next morning, with White Ensign at half-mast, we crept through Lyttelton Heads. Always we looked for trees, people and houses. How different it was from the day we left, and yet how much the same, as though we had dreamed some horrible nightmare, and could scarcely believe we were not dreaming still. The harbour master came out in the tug, and with him Atkinson and Pennell. "Come down here a minute," said Atkinson to me, and "It's made a tremendous impression. I had no idea it would make so much," he said. And indeed we had been too long away, and the whole thing was so personal to us, and our perceptions had been blunted, we never realized. We landed to find the Empire, almost the civilized world, in mourning. It was as though they had lost great friends. To a sensitive pre-war world the knowledge of these men's deaths came as a great shock, and now, although the world has almost lost the sense of tragedy, it appeals to their pity and their pride. The disaster may well be the first thing which Scott's name recalls to your mind, as though an event occurred in the life of Columbus which caused you to forget that he discovered America. But Scott's reputation was not founded upon the conquest of the South Pole. He came to a new continent, found out how to travel there, and gave knowledge of it to the world. He discovered the Antarctic and founded a school. He is the last of the great geographical explorers. It is useless to try and light a fire when everything has been burned, and he is probably the last old-fashioned polar explorer, for as I believe the future of such exploration is in the air, but not yet. And he was strong. We never realized until we found him lying there dead how strong, mentally and physically, that man was. In both his polar expeditions he was helped, to an extent which will never be appreciated, by Wilson. In the last expedition by Bowers. I believe that there has never been a finer sledge party than these three men, who combined in themselves initiative, endurance and high ideals to an extraordinary degree. And they could organise. They did organise the polar journey, and their organisations seem to have failed. Did it fail? Scott said no. "The causes of this disaster are not due to faulty organisation, but to misfortune in all risks which had to be undertaken." 9 times out of 10, says the meteorologist, he would have come through, but he struck the 10th. "We took risks, we knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint." No better epitaph has been written. He decided to use the only route towards the pole of which the world had any knowledge, and that is to go up the Beardmore Glacier, then the only discovered way up through the mountains which divide the polar plateau from the Great Ice Barrier. Probably it is the only possible passage for those who travel from McMurdo Sound. The alternative was to winter on the Barrier, as Amundsen did, so many 100 miles away from the coastline, that in travelling south the chaos caused in the ice plain by the Beardmore in its outward flow would be avoided. To do so meant the abandonment of a great part of the scientific programme, and Scott was not a man to go south just to reach the pole. Amundsen knew that Scott was going to McMurdo Sound when he decided to winter in the Bay of Whales, otherwise he might have gone to McMurdo Sound. Probably no man would have refused the knowledge which had already been gained. I have said that there are those who say that Scott should have relied on ski and dogs. If you read Shackleton's account of his discovery and passage of the Beardmore Glacier, you will not be prejudiced in favour of dogs. And as a matter of fact, though we found a much better way up than Shackleton, I do not believe it possible to take dogs up and down, and over the ice disturbances at the junction with the plateau, unless there is ample time to survey a route, if then. "Dogs could certainly have come up as far as this," I heard Scott say somewhere under the Cloudmaker, approximately halfway up the glacier, but the best thing you could do with dogs in pressure such as we all experienced on our way down would be to drop them into the nearest chasm. If you can avoid such messes, well and good. If not, you must not rely on dogs, and the people who talk of these things have no knowledge. If Scott was going up the Beardmore, he was probably right not to take dogs. Actually, he relied on ponies to the foot of the glacier, and man haulage on from that point. Because he relied on ponies, he was not able to start before November. The experience of the depot journey showed that ponies could not stand the weather conditions before that date, but he could have started earlier if he had taken dogs in place of ponies to the foot of the glacier. This would have gained him a few days in his race against the autumn conditions when returning. Such tragedies inevitably raise the question, is it worth it? What is worth what? Is life worth risking for a feat or losing for your country? To face a thing because it was a feat and only a feat was not very attractive to Scott. It had to contain an additional object, knowledge. A feat had even less attraction for Wilson, and it is a most noteworthy thing in the diaries which are contained in this book that he made no comment when he found that the Norwegians were first up the pole. It is as though he felt it did not really matter, as indeed it probably did not. It is most desirable that someone should tackle these and kindred questions about polar life. There is a wealth of matter in polar psychology. There are unique factors here, especially the complete isolation and 4 months' darkness every year. Even in Mesopotamia, a long-suffering nation insisted at last that adequate arrangements must be made to nurse and evacuate the sick and wounded. But at the poles a man must make up his mind that he may be rotting of scurvy, as Evans was, or living for 10 months on half rations of seal and full rations of ptomaine poisoning, as Campbell and his men were, but no help can reach him from the outside world for a year, if then. There is no chance of a cushy wound. If you break your leg on the Beardmore, you must consider the most expedient way of committing suicide, both for your own sake and that of your companions. Both sexually and socially, the polar explorer must make up his mind to be starved. To what extent can hard work, or what may be called dramatic imagination, provide a substitute? Compare our thoughts on the march, our food dreams at night, the primitive way in which the loss of a crumb of biscuit may give a lasting sense of grievance. Night after night I brought big buns and chocolate at a stall on the island platform at Hatfield Station, but always woke before I got a mouthful to my lips. Some companions who were not so highly strung were more fortunate, and ate their phantom meals. And the darkness, accompanied it may be almost continually by howling blizzards, which prevent you seeing your hand before your face. Life in such surroundings is both mentally and physically cramped. Open-air exercise is restricted, and in blizzards quite impossible, and you realise how much you lose by your inability to see the world around you when you are out of doors. I am told that when confronted by a lunatic, or one who under the influence of some great grief or shock contemplates suicide, you should take that man out of doors and walk him about. Nature will do the rest. To normal people like ourselves, living under abnormal circumstances, Nature could do much to lift our thoughts out of the rut of everyday affairs, but she loses much of her healing power when she cannot be seen, but only felt, and when that feeling is intensely uncomfortable. Somehow in judging polar life you must discount compulsory endurance, and find out what a man can shirk, remembering always that it is a sledging life which is the hardest test. It is because it is so much easier to shirk in civilization that it is difficult to get a standard of what your average man can do. It does not really matter much whether your man whose work lies in or round the hut shirks a bit or not, just as it does not matter much in civilization. It is just rather a waste of opportunity. But there's precious little shirking in barrier sledging. A week finds most of us out. There are many questions which ought to be studied. The effect upon men of going from heat to cold, such as Bowers coming to us from the Persian Gulf, or vice versa of Simpson returning from the Antarctic to India. Differences of dry and damp cold. What is a comfortable temperature in the Antarctic, and what is it compared to a comfortable temperature in England? The question of women in these temperatures. The man with the nerves goes farthest. What is the ratio between nervous and physical energy? What is vitality? Why do some things terrify you at one time and not at others? What is this early morning courage? What is the influence of imagination? How far can a man draw on his capital? Whence came Bowers' great heat supply, and my own white beard, and X's blue eyes, for he started from England with brown ones, and his mother refused to own him when he came back? Growth and colour change in hair and skin. There are many reasons which send men to the poles, and the intellectual force uses them all. But the desire for knowledge for its own sake is the one which really counts, and there is no field for the collection of knowledge which at the present time can be compared to the Antarctic. Exploration is the physical expression of the intellectual passion. And I tell you, if you have the desire for knowledge and the power to give it physical expression, go out and explore. If you are a brave man, you will do nothing. If you are fearful, you may do much, for none but cowards have need to prove their bravery. Some will tell you that you are mad, and nearly all will say, "What is the use?" For we are a nation of shopkeepers, and no shopkeeper will look at research which does not promise him a financial return within a year. And so you will sledge nearly alone, but those with whom you sledge will not be shopkeepers. That is worth a good deal. If you march your winter journeys, you will have your reward, so long as all you want is a penguin's egg. End of chapter 19, part 4. Recording by Kevin Green. End of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 2, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard.